So welcome. My name is Esperanto, and I'm an associate professor here at MIT in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences and the McGovern Institute. And welcome to all of you from our research team and the McGovern Institute more generally. We're very happy you're all here, and thank you for volunteering your wonderful brains for research. We hope to share some preliminary findings with you a little later. So my thank yous for making this event possible will come a little later. So I'll just say that this will be a nice celebration of all of our love of language and linguistics in general, and Conlangs, of course, in particular. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce all four speakers for the first session, and then we're just going to rotate through the talks, and we'll try to stay on time as much as possible. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our four wonderful Conlang creators. I'll go in turn. So we have in turn of how they're going to speak. So David and Jesse will co-present. So David Peterson got his undergraduate degree at Berkeley and his graduate degree from UC San Diego. In 2007, he co-founded the Language Creation Society, which many of you may be very familiar with, and he was its president for a few years. In 2015, he published the book, The Art of Language Invention, which, again, many of you may be familiar with. And perhaps most famously, he created all of the fictional languages for the Game of Thrones, along with several others for other shows and such. Jessie Sams is now a professor of linguistics at Stephen Austin State University. She got her undergraduate degree at Truman State, and then her PhD from University of Colorado Boulder. And she, more generally, so she teaches a class on invented languages, but her main job is she works on syntax and semantics and linguistics of dialogue. And since 2019, she has been a professional conlanger for the series Motherland, Fort Salem. Okay, then we have Mark Okrent. He's over there. So Mark got his undergraduate degree at Santa Cruz. A lot of Californians here, eh? He got his PhD at Berkeley, and he was then a professor there for a few years. No, not there, at Santa Barbara, still in California. And then for many years, he worked at the National Captioning Institute, and he actually, I just learned this today, that he helped develop the first closed captioning system for those with hearing impairments. And at some point in the early 80s, while I guess working for captioning one of the Oscars, he met the producer of the movie Star Trek II and eventually got hired by Paramount to create Klingon. And subsequently, he published 3 books about Klingon and developed several other Conlangs. Okay, and last but not least, we have Paul Frommer right here. And Paul got his bachelor's in math from University of Rochester. Then he taught English and math in Malaysia with a Peace Corps for a few years, and eventually got kind of increasingly interested in linguistics and ended up getting a PhD at University of Southern California. I guess it was like in 81. Then he worked in industry for a few years, and then he returned to the USC Business School, where he is now a professor of management communication. And of course, most famously for all of us, in 2009, Paul was chosen as a creator of the Navi language for Avatar. Okay, so let's give a warm welcome to David and Jesse.
There we go. All right, so we've been working together since 2019, and as a brief recap / overview of what we've done together, our first job that we worked together was the Minishe language for Motherland Fort Salem. Since then, we have founded Langtime Studio, where we create languages for anthropomorphic animals. And so far, we have 4 languages going. We've got languages for rabbits, possums, mice, and cats. Next season, when we start that, it'll be for dogs. And we've also worked on Shadow and Bone together, specifically second season and moving forward. And we worked on the show Paper Girls, where we created a language called Quechua, and we were very excited about it, only to find out that they cut all of it from the actual show. But we did it. And we're also now working on spin-offs for The Witcher. So while I'm not working on the Hinlinga with David, we are working on spin-off projects together. We also worked on the Ajnamari language, which appeared in Vampire Academy on the Peacock. And, I'm going to plug that now. Watch it. Get it a second season because it's a lot of fun for us to work on. If you don't like vampires, just close your eyes while the TV is on for an hour. It's fine. And also, I started working with David on Dune, on the second Dune movie, which will at some point be out. So by the numbers, in the past 3 years, we have created 12 language sketches, 10 full conlangs, 2 partial projects. I consider them partial when I joined David halfway through the language creation process. And we've got another 6+ projects in the pipeline. So we're 30 projects strong, so we feel like we can confidently talk about collaborative conlanging here.
No. So conlanging tends to be a solo activity. This is, I think, what most conlangers know. But even so, there are many times where conlangers have worked together to collaborate. In fact, my first one would have been, I would say, in early 2001 with the old project where we all tried to create different daughter languages from one proto-language. Anyway, but the question is, like, how do you do it most effectively? Because I've done it many, many times over the past 22 years. Very few times has actually been very effective. And so what we wanted to talk about were kind of 5 habits of happy conlang collaborators, and emphasize happy here because you actually can do work that is effective without necessarily enjoying the process. And I've done it all 3 ways, really. I've done very good conlang work that I was very happy with Jesse, very good conlang work where I just did not enjoy the process at all, and just very poor conlang work. And actually both of those too. There were a couple that were really fun, we just didn't do very much or do it very well. But the number one factor here is respect, and this is, I think, most important for happiness. The respect has to go both ways, and it has to be for every single person involved in the process. In other words, you have to respect each other's different work styles, because as all conlangers know, we kind of tend to work differently. There are very few conlangers that work exactly the same. Some like to be very, very methodical. Some like to start in one place versus another. And so you have to respect that the person that you're working with may work differently from you, but is still going to work effectively. And then you also have to value their intellectual input. And so I know, keep laughing. We're not going to talk about the bad ones, but I mean, you have to respect that the person that you're working with, is a conlanger in their own right. It is a good conlanger and has some really valuable input to give to the process, so that ultimately the result is, your collective vision and not just one person's vision where every so often somebody else gets to chime in.
And so speaking of a collective vision, it really helps if you actually share a creative vision as you're working on a project together. And so every project brings its own unique challenges. And so figuring out how to have a different creative vision for every project can be a daunting task, but it is one that conlangers undertake. And if you don't have a vision that you share with your partner, it will go wonky pretty quickly. And I think this is one of the biggest problems, because we have also seen with our Langtime Studio community, a lot of people trying to get together to create collaborative conlangs. And they usually fall apart somewhere around week 3. Mm-hmm. Of work. And that's partially because everybody on the project came into it with a completely different idea for what they wanted to do with the language, and they couldn't figure out how to make those visions come together as a unified unit. So you really have to be able to share the larger goals of the language with your partner or partners. And so then you also have to have a team approach to solving all of the many challenges that are going to be thrown your way, from not just, what sounds are we going to have and how are they going to shift, but then also how are we going to grow this vocabulary and start actually doing translations. And so all the challenges across the projects, you really have to come together and have a teamwork attitude. It doesn't work to just say, well, this is what I'm doing. I don't care what you want on the vocabulary. That never works, except when I tell you this word has to be in it. Then it works.
So, splitting tests, this is actually one of the places where I think conlanging is working as a team on a conlang can actually be quite effective, because creating a language feels like one big task, but it's actually not. It's a whole bunch of very, very, very different tasks. So I don't know what this, yeah, anyway, that was just what I said. I'm just going to look at the two things that it says, and then I'm going to say stuff. So anyway, but like if you think about it, especially just out of curiosity, because I know that there are many people here who came because you've studied one or more languages. How many people are actually language creators? Raise your hands. Ooh, raise them high. Yeah, there we go. Nice. All right, so those of you who have created languages will know this. Others who haven't will learn this, but it's a very different thing to create a phonological system, the sound system of a language, versus creating, for example, the verbal system of a language, versus creating vocabulary, versus creating idioms, versus creating a unique writing system, if you have that. Even slightly separate from designing a romanization system, which is just how you write it with the Roman alphabet. All of these are slightly different tasks that engage slightly different areas of your brain. They're obviously all involved in the overall project, but they kind of speak to different sides of your personality. And if there are conlangers out there who, for example, and I've heard this a lot, who are really interested in grammar and come up with really interesting grammar systems, but shut down when it comes to creating vocabulary, I mean, there's a reason for that. These are two very, very different tasks. And because of that, it makes sense that you could actually split these tasks amongst team members, right? You just essentially go to your strengths. For somebody, I mean, anybody who's done this, there are people who love creating like noun class systems or case systems. There are people who love verbs. There are those who love vocabulary generation. For those of you who don't believe it, it's true. I'm one of those people. I love vocabulary generation. And there are conlangers who would be very happy if, like, say they were set a conlang task, if all they were doing was creating noun cases. And so this is the type of thing where it's like you have to figure out where are the strengths of your team members, where do they lie, where do their interests lie, and maybe just decide, all right, you know what, I'm going to back off from this part of it and just focus on this part. And then, of course, the division is important and also the trust is important. Because if you give somebody the task of saying, all right, you're in charge of the noun case system, then they are in charge of the noun case system. And you, at the phonology, don't get to come in and say, well, you know what, maybe you should probably do this and this and this. It's like, no. That's not how division and trust works. So it's really, I think creating a language, it really helps. Like, it's something that you can do as a team. Everybody just needs to be on board. Everybody needs to be on the same page. Sorry.
And this is especially important when you get hired for a job and get told you need to have this language done in 10 days. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was fun. You also, it really helps if you have matching work ethics. And by this, I mean, like, you both bring, or all, if it's more than two people, bring meaningful contributions to the project, but also time-efficient ones, because creative types especially have all sorts of different styles of how they get to their, level of creativity. And if you're on a project with a deadline, whether it's a class project or, a professional one, you have to make sure that the work gets done. And so if you are a creative type that just needs a lot of downtime where you do no work at all, and then the last 24 hours you don't sleep and you just get it all done at once because your brain has been percolating the entire time, that's not going to work so well with somebody who needs to have a different, style, a different approach to how they work on the project. And so it really, again, it just breaks down to being able to divide and conquer, so to speak, and knowing that you're both going to be doing it in a time-effective way, and that you can, this is, I think, built into respect as well. I think it can be really hard to respect other people's work processes that are so different from your own, that like you can't understand what they're doing, and so you can't respect, like, if they need that downtime to percolate ideas, you look at them and say, well, gosh, you're not doing anything, thanks. And so that, like, builds a bit of resentment. But if you understand it, because that's how you work too, then you can support each other in the process. And so if the way that you work actually matches, it really, really helps.
I will say that for the previous collaborations I've done, this is honestly where things break down the most. It's not, respect. Usually you're getting together with people you like, and everybody knows their strengths and they're really engaged in it. but it's the type of thing where one person sits down and does 7 pages of grammar in 24 hours, and the other person isn't doing anything, and sometimes gets a little bit turned off by that because they look and say, oh, well, they did all that much, and I didn't really do anything, and then they're just less engaged. And basically, once somebody's not engaged, then pretty soon they're out of it, and pretty soon it just dies. So yeah, this one's really important. Last one is having a lead voice, and I think this is important especially for a job, where it's just there's just somebody at the top that is kind of guiding things basically when it's it could be this or that, somebody is there to make a decision. And so it's important to have a lead for each task, I think, and then, of course, they have to be a good leader and be sure to respect what everybody else is doing and compromise. And a great example of this was on the second season of Shadow and Bone. We had 2 full languages to do, and basically we just, we didn't split them up in that we did separate languages, but basically I was the lead on Zemini, and Jesse was the lead on Shu, and so we kind of worked on, kind of parts of it separately the way we did, and then we came together, but it was when it comes to who is the best person with this language, who's the one that's calling the shots, it was Jesse for Shu and then me for Zemini, and it just works a little bit better as long as everybody is on board with it. Because of course, if somebody thinks they're the lead, but nobody else does, that of course leads to problem. So it's kind of a lot of the stuff that you learned working on group projects in high school for things that you didn't want to do are still important when it comes to doing stuff you actually want to do. So, go for it.
Oh yeah, this is just the summary.
Cool.
So, but yeah, a lot of this is just repeating what you would learn in teamwork. But I think it's really interesting when it gets applied to especially very creative projects like conlanging, because there are of course systematic decisions that we make, but at the same time there are also very creative processes that have to go in, and that can be difficult. Underneath it all, that respect is so important because you just have to be able to say, yes, these are good ideas that you have, and you have to respect that. And so this is thank you in many of our languages. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And we're very excited. Thank you to MIT and all the people who worked to make this happen, because this is pretty amazing. So thank you. And if you want to find us on social media, you can find us on Instagram together at Linktime Studio, or separately, I'm at Quoth the Linguist, and David is at Davrazar.
All right. Cool. Okay, so I think we have 5 minutes for questions.
Oh, I thought we were doing one next to. Oh, we're good?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I was
Yes.
ready to run.
I know you have a lot of conscripts on
Yeah.
there. Do they let you do that, or is that the set designer or the?
If they're up there, we did it. But no, that's a very mixed bag. Sometimes we get to do it. Sometimes we get to do one, and then sometimes we don't. It's usually better when we do it. Yeah. Yep.
So I know you've done a lot of work for a lot of shows and movies and all that. Any, if you can say, any projects in the work for any Star Wars content?
No, I was interviewed for a Star Wars show once, and then they never got back to me.
Ruin that.
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry. Yes, in the back.
When you make a language for a specific television show, do other members of the creative team ever ask you if it has to fit a certain aesthetic or sound a certain way to be part
Yes.
of the script?
Yeah, so that's usually where we start, is working with their production team on the show or movie, and they tell us what they're looking for in the language. And it usually is some sort of aesthetic description that quite often makes no sense to us, really, because it's we want it to be melodic but guttural and very linguistical in style, and we're like, all right. And so usually we're kind of working through all that to figure out how to create something that will sound a way to them that they're happy with. But yeah, we always start with, here's a sound system. What do you think?
Yeah.
Oh, we got here and then here.
Are you usually working with phrases, sometimes working with phrases that they give you, oh, we want these characters to say these things, and then the translation is part of how the language created? Or are you mostly working with, we need a language, and then you provide them the language, and then they translate it?
It's mostly the latter. Honestly, the only times where there have been phrases was when it came from books. Like when it was just a show, it's never been the case that they've had, set phrases they wanted them to say ahead of time. There have been character names sometimes that needed to be incorporated, or sometimes even the name of the language itself, but no, not set phrases. That was only from books, and then it's like a little bit up to interpretation how you read it.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any differences between languages that you created solo and languages that you created collaboratively with somebody else?
Yeah, the languages I create with Jesse are better. I mean, I think that each of us has a definite style. When you look at languages that we've just done on our own, you can tell. But I think we balance each other out a lot better. I think it comes off better overall.
I agree.
Yeah.
Very subjective.
Yeah.
You talked about how you split up tasks, so like one person can do the vocabulary, one person can do like phonology, and then the verbs and the nouns and all that. Are there major like structural decisions you have to make together first before you split up and do your own task?
There could be decisions at the top level that could be done together, but also for some projects, we just don't have the time, and so we just have to, again, when we assign sort of a lead voice, like you're going to be the lead on this, that person really decides the structure, and then we both work within those parameters.
I would also say that like vocabulary is usually the last part. So it's like if you were to assign one person vocabulary, like they wouldn't be doing anything for a bit, because the language has to get built up a bit first before you get there. I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, it's sort of related to that question. I guess it's solved by vocabulary kind of coming last, but if there's like idioms, for example, are dependent on vocabulary existing, how do you deal with the sort of like blocking tasks where somebody is depending on someone else? Like, is that just a scheduling thing where it's like we realize what we have to do first?
Well, I was going to say, when we create idioms, usually, like, if one of us has an idea, it's a semantic-based one, and then we'll look and be like, do we have a word in the language yet? If we don't, now we need to work together to create a word to be able to use for it. And so it's sort of, we come to each other with ideas at that point.
Yeah, and I think it actually works out really well. It's just like you just have an idea, like, I think it would be really cool if we had this idiom that was this. And then I'm like, yeah, that's a great idea. Now let's see what vocabulary we need to create to support that. Usually works out all right.
So I think for trying to come up with common greetings in Chicopsa for Dune, I was brainstorming pages of ideas for, like, we could use this expression, ran them all by David, and he picked his favorite. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was good. All right, let's move it along.
Hello. I should introduce myself. I'm Mark Okran. My connection to all this stuff is Klingon mostly, although I've done some other things too. What I'm going to talk about is very different from what David and Jesse talked about, obviously, because I did it all by myself, or started anyway, doing it all by myself. So what I thought I would talk about is sort of where Klingon came from and how it got to be the way it turned out to be, or how it's becoming, or something like that. When you make up a language, or more accurately, in my case, and in their case too, when you make up a language for somebody else, you don't start from nothing. It comes with instructions, or at the very least, there's some kind of a world where it's going to fit in, where it's going to be a part. And for Klingon, of course, that world is Star Trek. And if we look back at the original series from the 1960s, where it all began, we don't learn a whole lot about various alien languages. And that's because, for the most part, the idea of different species from the galaxy speaking different languages was just ignored. That is, everybody everywhere spoke English, or whatever language the show happened to be dubbed into. The show did acknowledge the idea of different species speaking different languages. They talk about a device that they would need so that they could understand everybody. And eventually they called that a universal translator. But for the most part, no, English is just the lingua franca of the galaxy. For Klingons in particular, we know they had their own language. We know that from the get-go. One of the original episodes, Trouble with Tribbles, there's a Klingon guy named Korax who insists that half the quadrant is learning to speak what he calls Klingonese. But we never hear Klingonese because he doesn't speak it. He only speaks English, as do all of the other Klingons in Star Trek in the original series. So apparently the universal translator is either in operation on all the time. I don't know what is going on there. Which is not to say there was no alien dialogue in Star Trek. We heard some Vulcan, for example, in the original series. There's words like lirpa, which is some kind of a weapon. This Vulcan certainly was not a Conlang, with the possible exception of a one-word sentence, kroika, which means stop. It's a command that means stop. It consisted only of a bunch of nouns. And the phonology was generally just English phonology with syllables kind of jumbled up in some funny way. But they started getting a little bit language savvy with the first movie, Star Trek: The Motion Picture. At the beginning of that film, Spock, you know Spock, is participating in a ritual called Kolinar. And when they filmed the scene, the dialogue was in English. But in post-production, they changed it to Vulcan. And the reason for changing it makes sense from a story point of view, because we're watching an ancient Vulcan ceremony on the Vulcan planet, and there's nobody around except Vulcans, so of course they should be talking Vulcan. But the real reason they made the change, the Hollywood insider reason they made the change, is they just didn't like the way it sounded. But this Vulcan was not a Conlang either, because what they did, since it was already filmed, is create gobbledygook that when spoken matched the lip movements of the English that was already there, and then the actor dubbed it in. Okay, so it's like dubbing in a foreign language in a film, except for the lips, the mouth had to match. Of course, when they were off camera, they could do whatever they wanted, but it was mostly this lip syncing thing. Real conlanging in Star Trek began with Star Trek III, Search for Spock, but the roots, or the first glimmers or whatever of the language were probably, well, not were probably, were definitely in the first movie, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which was 5 years before that. In the very, very beginning of that film, there's Klingons. And one of them speaks this strange language no one has ever heard before, and there's subtitles. That's a real thing. There was not very many lines. There's, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 of these lines. He's just barking out commands for the most part. He says, Juntach, which means evasive. And Bach, Bach means fire. Fire the torpedo. That dialogue, that language, if you will, was invented by a couple of people, John Poville, who was one of the producers, and James Doohan, the guy who played Scotty all the time, those two guys. Poville described the language, this is his words, as nonsense syllables. It's clicks and grunts and hisses, which is not a very good description of a conlang, I would hope. But it was a start. And for Star Trek III, the writer and producer of that, Harv Bennett, he's the one who decided there should be a Klingon language, and he hired me. The idea was to start with the words and sounds and syllables that were heard in the motion picture, but we wanted to get beyond the grunts and hisses, so we decided to come up with a complete language, in other words, do conlanging. And I just said the idea was to come up with a complete language. That's not really true. Because all I set out to do at first was to come up with what was needed for the film, and nothing more. So I approached my task in the same way a set designer or set builder approaches their task. In other words, if you have a movie set, you know, looks really good from the front, but the back is just plywood held up by 2x4s. If there's a door, but in the scene, you never have to open the door doesn't open, right, on the set. And the language was the same way. If they had to say it in the film, I made up what you needed to do to say it, and if it didn't come up in the film, I didn't make it up. So the language was extremely, extremely sketchy at the very, very beginning. And when you construct the language, step one, I think, or maybe step zero, is to know who the speakers are, and who's going to make use of this language. So, who or what are Klingons? For one thing, we know they're not human, therefore they should not speak a human language. They speak a non-human language. Well, what does that mean? Well, languages, human languages anyway, have certain things in common, to be overly simplistic, things like consonants and vowels and words and stuff. They have certain tendencies, certain sounds tend to go together in the same language, certain grammatical features tend to go together in the same language, certain ones don't. Some features are a lot more common in the world than others and stuff. So to make Klingon a non-human language, it made sense to violate or steer away from some of these rules and tendencies and commonalities. These things are sometimes called universals, though in the context of Star Trek, applying the word universals to just Earth languages seems kind of pretentious. Anyway, since Klingon isn't a human language, it doesn't have to pay strict attention to these human language rules. On the other hand, there was a practical matter to consider because all of the actors who were going to speak this language were human. And they had to be able to say the lines. So there wasn't going to be any electronic enhancement or play tapes backwards, or any of that kind of stuff. So out of deference to the humanness of the actors, all of the sounds in Klingon can be found in some human language or other. But the collection is unique. No human language is likely to have that particular set of sounds. And so the language sounds a bit bizarre for that reason. And this bizarreness actually makes Klingon difficult to pronounce if you do it correctly. But that's okay, because for the actors, after practicing a few times, they'd only have to pronounce the lines, if we're lucky, once or twice, right? Then they take the take is over, and they never have to say the line ever again in their whole life, right? So it was okay if it was hard. I also tried to, the same approach with the grammar to make the grammar unusual. For a simple sentence that has a subject and a verb and an object, those three elements have to come in some order or other. And mathematically, there's 6 possibilities: subject, verb, object, verb, so on. There's 6 ways you can flip them around. If you look around the world, 87% or so of the languages on Earth have the subject comes first. About 1% are languages where the object comes first. Therefore, for Klingon, the object comes first, because in a funny way, it's the least human. So I made up Klingon versions of all the lines that the script said somebody is speaking Klingon. I also made up Klingon versions of all the lines where Klingons were speaking English to each other, in case, while the filming process was going on, someone would say, "Hey, why are the Klingons talking English to each other? They should talk Klingon." I could say, "Here, say this." They used 0 of those lines, but it helped flesh out the language, so it was a good thing to do. But that's it. I didn't make up anything else, absolutely nothing else. And at the time, I had no reason to believe that there would ever be a need to make up anything else. Then filming began, and now this made-up language, such as it was, comes face-to-face with reality. That means filmmaking. So on the set, my job was to coach the actors and approve the takes. Right each time after the scene was filmed, the director would say, "How was the Klingon?" And if it was okay, I'd say okay. And if it was not okay, I would say it was not okay. I learned very quickly not to give that second answer very often. But I kept track of what was going on. And if it was a kind of a trivial mistake, if the actor said toe, but he was supposed to say to, I'd say, "Okay, fine. From now on, the word is toe." So it changed. Sometimes, depending on which syllable the actor mispronounced or dropped out or something, there might be an effect on the grammar. So not only did the sounds, the particular words change, but the grammar changed. But overall, the actors did a good job. I was pleased. I was able to work in all these changes into the language, so it was okay. And I went home figuring that I was finished. But then they went into post-production, and this had an effect on the language as well. For one thing, they changed their mind, and now the Klingons talking English to each other sometimes are supposed to talk Klingon. But I couldn't give them all those phrases I made up before because it's already filmed. So we had to go back to the lip-syncing technique and make up Klingon to match the lips, but now I'm constrained by the sound system of Klingon and the grammar and vocabulary and all this kind of stuff. Or they left the soundtrack alone, but they changed the subtitles. So there's a line, which originally meant, "I told you, engine only." Just shoot, destroy the engine. But the subtitle says, "I wanted prisoners." Okay, what are we going to do? Well, the object comes first, so kamapu is the first word, so that must mean prisoners, and so on. So anyway, was able to make it work. Now, during this time, I wrote a book called the Klingon Dictionary, which contains all of the words from the movies and some more stuff, and a description of the grammar. And I said, great, now my Conlang is in print. I can look up the words, I can look up the grammatical rules, I don't have to remember any of this stuff, and this made everything harder. Because working on the next films that had Klingon in them, so Star Trek 5 and 6, I had to go by the book, and if the actor made a mistake, right, I still had to follow the book. So now if the actor said toe instead of to, I had to make up a whole word toe, but that didn't, make the original to disappear, and so on. It was a trickier thing to do. At about this time, Star Trek was getting into high gear. Star Trek: The Next Generation was going, followed by Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and all these other things. And there was lots more Klingon in these TV shows and later movies. The writers of those shows seemed to have liked the language because they used it a lot. But how accurate the language was depended on who the writer or producer was, and sometimes who the actor was. And they had different approaches. Sometimes they would consult with me. Sometimes they would just find the dictionary and go through it, and sometimes they found the right words. Sometimes they get the pronunciation right, mostly not. Sometimes they found what they thought were the right words, but they ignored the grammar entirely. And sometimes, in fact, most of the time, they just made stuff up. But if a character said it in Star Trek, in a TV show, in a movie, that made it automatically legit. So I had to incorporate it into the language somehow to kind of Klingonize the whole thing. When I wrote the book, the Klingon Dictionary, which is almost 40 years ago, which is absolutely scary, I hoped, of course, that people would buy it. But what I didn't realize is how closely they would read it and study it and analyze it. And a whole new subculture developed of Klingon speakers. The internet was getting going at about the same time, and I think that played a role because people could find each other. And this Klingon-speaking community, including especially some members of this Klingon-speaking community who are there somewhere, are unbelievably creative. They translate and write songs and stories and books, or they just carry on discussions. And as they do this, they've discovered, let's say, some gaps in the language, and they ask for more, especially vocabulary that they need because they want to talk about the things that those of us on Earth talk about. And I provide that probably at a much more sluggish rate than people would like, but it happens. The significant thing, though, is that there's been a shift in Klingon of what influences or instigates or spurs on the growth of the language. It's shifted from Hollywood producers and writers to speakers of the language are sort of responsible for the shape that it's taking. Another interesting thing that's come about as a result of this Klingon-speaking community is that the producers of Star Trek and some other shows and creators of other kinds of projects have, over the past, 5, 6, 7, 10 years or so, hired some really, really good Klingon speakers to do their Klingon translation. In fact, the currently running Star Trek shows, the ones who are on I was going to say on TV, they're on streaming something or other right now. There's 5 of them rotating around in some weird way. Not all, but most of the Klingon in those shows was provided by members of the Klingon-speaking community, not by me. So just as there are speakers of Spanish or French or Swahili or anything else who can translate, from their languages, there's Klingon speakers who can provide the same sort of service. Now, I should note that I don't feel pushed aside by that. I think it's great. I think it's terrific. Sort of what started out as a very incomplete Conlang, there's more of a sketch, has been pushed and shoved and stretched in various directions by multiple stakeholders into a going and growing concern. I'm not sure where it's going next or how it's going to grow or how it compares with other languages constructed and otherwise. So I'll stop now because I'm told my time is up, and also because I don't know what's going to happen next, so maybe these MRI things will tell us something. I don't know. So, yeah.
It kind of, in a way, sounds like the language ended up developing like real languages do, in that it started off one way and then like took many different turns. But I, despite my badge color, don't speak Klingon. I'm kind of curious if you think that it took too many turns and now it kind of doesn't make a lot of linguistical sense, or does it like really kind of look like English or something like that?
Well, yeah. No, it doesn't look like English. No, you know, it did take twists and turns, but still in its own world, so to speak. You know, it follows. The people who speak it don't go off in 700 different directions. They pay very close attention to what it is. As I said, they're created as need be. Well, let me take it a step back. They don't create any new grammar. They don't create any new official vocabulary. They do create slang. They're very clever about coming up with jargon to discuss various topics and stuff like that. But someone asked me the other day, is there an academy of Klingon or something like that, you know, making all these decisions and judgments, and I'm standing here. So, that was not my decision, by the way. It was kind of thrust upon me. But for the time being, that's the way it works. So yeah, there are all kinds of constraints. Yeah. Are there any native speakers of Klingon? The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is there's one and maybe more attempts, but I know of one attempt to raise a kid to speak, you know, Klingon as he was growing up, and that worked out fine for a couple of years until the kid discovered that there wasn't anybody else to talk to, and he lost interest altogether. I know this kid. He's about 25 years old now, and he's just fine. Yeah. Yeah.
How does conlanging change when you're creating a language in a futuristic society that has technology that we don't have necessarily?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think of the best way to say. I don't have to worry about that. Because all the work I've done for the TV show and for the movies, the writers decided what it is that the technology is and what they're going to talk about and stuff like that. Where the growth of the language has come from is not, as I was saying, is not so much that, but it's from the people who speak the language who don't want to talk about ion transducer or something or others, but want to talk about a loaf of bread. Okay? Yeah.
I always have a surface knowledge of resemblance, but do you think that the community, and I have the impression that the community is mostly in the hemisphere, I mean that's not really true, but do you think the community has introduced like semantic and pragmatic influence from English?
There's a lot of English influence in it because most of the speakers are English. You're right about that, but it's still not English. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of the brain thing, what are your thoughts on the study that they're doing here? And do you think that the way that you designed Klingon to be on Earth-like might change the way that it's processed in the brain?
We'll find out. That's what we're here for. One of the things that maybe this thing will show is Klingon different from other Conlangs? Okay, because a lot of the other Conlangs were designed more completely from the get-go. Okay, whereas English Klingon grew as need be. It's a different kind of thing, and it was designed not to be. To use the words I was using before, not to be human-like, whereas a lot of these other languages were specifically designed to be human-like. So when you do all this brain stuff, will Klingon stand out in some way, different from some of the other I don't know. We'll see. Yeah, in the back.
Do you find that Klingon going off in these different directions and incorporating new material and trying to make it work for the show, does that make it resemble natural languages in having exceptions and irregularities? Does that help it have those?
Yeah. Yeah, well, mostly what helps it have exceptions and irregularities when the writers make stuff up. Yeah. One more. Last one.
Did your goals change for like the grammar and vocabulary that you introduced in the language when the external forces changed from the movie studio telling you what to do to like the community asking for things?
my goals didn't change. I stopped worrying so much about does it fit into outer space, you know. But everything else is the same. Yeah. All right, thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And a big thank you to Ev and Saima and Elise and everyone else instrumental in putting this together. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the genesis of Na'vi, tell you some of the highlights of its structure, and then say a few things about what has happened to the language since Avatar debuted in 2009. So when I got the assignment, which was way back in 2005, there were certain constraints I was under. Whoops. Some of them were, yeah. You know what's coming. So some of them were externally imposed and some self-imposed. The externally imposed constraints came from this gentleman here, James Cameron. And so when Jim spoke to me, what he wanted was an entirely new language, not based on anything else. He wanted it to sound nice. Of course, that is very much a subjective decision. There'll be no electronic manipulation of the voices. You've heard this stuff before, right? Right, from Mark, same thing. So that what the actors could produce was what you would hear in the movie theater. Hello. Here we go. He wanted me to stay consistent with his original words. He had come up with about 30 words of his own, mainly names of characters, animals, and so on. The language had to be learnable by humans because that's part of the storyline, and of course it had to be feasible for the actors. I also had constraints that I imposed upon myself. One was that it had to stand up to linguistic scrutiny. I had a strong suspicion that there'd be a contingent among the moviegoers who would examine the language, pounce on it with a microscope, which is what happened. I wanted to make it interesting to people who might want to learn it. I wanted to make it unusual, given that it's an alien language. And then I wanted to balance complexity with accessibility, which is to say, I wanted to avoid two extremes. One extreme would be create a language with a grammar so incredibly complex that people would just throw up their hands in frustration. The other extreme would be to create something very, very accessible and very simplistic that would just bore people to death. So, that being said, the linguistic structure and framework, which again is something that's very, very common to Conlangs. We talk about phonetics and phonology, the sounds and sound system of the language, morphology, the word building rules, syntax, the rules for putting words together in phrases and sentences, and then the interplay between language, culture, and environment. Okay, so let's begin delving into phonetics and phonology. Here are the consonants of Na'vi. There are 20 of them. As you can see, a lot of them are very familiar. This, by the way, is the Na'vi spelling system, not IPA. The most interesting ones that have attracted the most attention are the ones in the first line, the ejectives. These are popping sounds that sound like and o and and they're actually found in real Earth languages. The apostrophe is not for decoration. It's a glottal stop. It's a real consonant. It's what you hear in English, uh-oh. Na'vi has 7 vowels. It has 2 pseudo-vowels, which are consonants that kind of behave like vowels. And so we have words like gl, which means ground, and dr, which means day. 4 diphthongs. 3 of them are very familiar, ow, I, a. And the 4th that sort of completes the symmetrical set, eo, is also possible. It's less familiar. Okay, but if you just got the sounds, you still have a long process to develop the sound system. So for example, where can the sounds exist in a syllable? Linguists will say, what are the phonotactic constraints? Well, for example, only 12 consonants can be in syllable final position, and those are the ones in red here. So Na'vi has an S, but no Na'vi word could possibly end in S. What about consonant clusters? Consonants that come together that abut within a syllable. We have no final consonant clusters. We do have initial consonant clusters, And this is a complete set. Every initial consonant cluster has to begin with one of the red sounds followed by one of the blue sounds. But this excludes a lot of very common consonant clusters. In English, for example, there's no PL, there's no KR, and so on. What you do get is some rather unusual looking consonant clusters. We have words like fngap, fpakim, skom, steli, ske, sngauvik. These are really fun to pronounce. Okay, but then there are pronunciation rules. For example, here are six very common words in the language. Nadi is I. To say in the I, me, nadi. Me is the word for in. So kifke is world. What's in the world? You would think me kifke. No, it's me hifke. Okay, and all of these initial consonants change to other consonants through a very systematic process. It's called lenition. So that's one of the pronunciation rules of Na'vi. If you speak the language, this has to become absolutely automatic and second nature to you. Okay, moving on to morphology. What do the verbs look like? Okay, here's an example. The verb for hunt is daron, and here are some inflected forms. Dolaron, tayaron, tievaron, tirmarayon, and so on. These mean things like has hunted, will hunt, may hunt in the future, has just hunted, and I feel good about it. So what's happening? So this is what's happening. The black elements are meaningful elements, morphemes, that carry information about tense and aspect and attitude. But rather than being prefixed to a root or suffixed to a root, they're infixed. They kind of shove right in the middle of the root, which is possible in human languages, but relatively rare. What about nouns and pronouns? Well, the pronouns are kind of interesting in that there are gendered and non-gendered forms. So in Na'vi, you never have to ask someone what their pronouns are. We have words for she, poe, and he, poan, pronouns, but the more common term is simply po, which means either he or she. Okay, what about nouns? Well, here is a noun. Etukan is a character name, and here are the 6 different forms that the noun that the name can appear in, and these are 6 cases. Na'vi has what's called a tripartite case system. So genitive, dative are very familiar. The first 3 need a little bit of explanation. So in a sentence like, John is sleeping, that's an intransitive structure. John is not doing anything to anything else. But in Mary ate the ice cream, Mary is doing something to ice cream. So we call John S for subject. Mary is an agent because she's doing something to something else. P is the patient, often called object. What's unusual about Na'vi is that all 3 of these are marked differently. Now, there are Earth languages that do that. They're extraordinarily rare. So one thing the case system allows you to do is have a lot of word order flexibility. So here are 6 different ways to say etukan sees netiri. As Mark said, there are 3 factorial permutations of 3 elements, and because of the case system, every one of these is grammatical and means the same thing. Now, this word order flexibility is something that permeates the language. In general, modifiers can come either before or after the heads. So adjectives can come before or after the noun. You can say the equivalent of new word or word new. And you notice that this A is a linking morpheme which always comes between the noun and adjective, whether it precedes or follows. Your father can be either your father or father your. Relative clauses, the sound that I hear can also be the I hear it sound. We have adpositions rather than prepositions, so teri Na'vi or Na'vi teri is about Na'vi. Okay, vocabulary. How do you construct words? There are 4 different ways, essentially. The least common is borrowing. There are certain situations in which it is appropriate to borrow a word. The Na'vi don't have a written language, they don't have books. So in order to say book, they simply borrow the English word, book, That's what the word book comes out as when you filter it through the Navi sound system. Same thing for gunship, same thing for earth. Then there are derivational processes, which are very common in language. You can take, for example, a verb and change it into a noun. Taron is hunt. Titaron, the abstract concept of hunting. Sataron, a hunt. Taron, you, a hunter. You can also combine existing items in interesting ways. So interesting is elturtitensi, which means actually exciting the brain. Computer is eltulefngap. Metal brain actually is nifketo ngai, and the components are ne, which is an adverbial element, tifketo, which means situation, and ngai, which means true. So the word actually means new situationally. And then we have new roots. Lord is beautiful. Eving is child. This is where you just make up words. And that's really kind of the fun part. That's where the art comes in, I think. Vrtep is demon. I sometimes had fun in doing a little bit of iconicity, where the form of the word has something to do with the meaning. So ftue is easy. It kind of seemed like a nice, easy kind of word. Difficult is ngazik. Smooth is fawi. And rough is ektu. Okay. One of the most interesting things is to adapt the language to its culture, environment, and sometimes even to the physiology of the Navi. They have, for example, 4 digits on each hand rather than 5. So it seemed to me that they would have a base 8 counting system, and Jim Cameron said, yep. So the way you count in Navi is 1 through 8. And then 9 is essentially 8 and 1, 10 is 8 and 2, and so on. There's an honorific and ceremonial register of the language used for special purposes where things change. The word for oe, the word for I rather is oe, but in the ceremonial register is ohe, nga becomes ngang, nga, lu to be becomes luyu. And one of the most fun parts, this is what I really love, is to come up with proverbs, idioms, similes, metaphors that would be appropriate to the environment and to the people. So for example, good action. The tail and ears also speak. If you watch the movie, the tails and ears are very expressive, and this is saying don't just listen to the words, look at the body language. This is a proverb that includes a little bit of word play. Good action, bad result. When you do something with best intentions, doesn't come out well, and you have the word play between kem, action, and cum, result. I like this. Fweke ke fwefwi. A mantis doesn't move. A fweke is a mantis. A fwefwi is a verb to whistle. What it means is don't expect someone to do something that's not in their nature. And you have the word play between fweke and fwefwi, which I kind of like. Finally, pailalip, etirip. Dripping water pierces a rock. It's pretty clear what that means. Leap is drip, and reap is pierce. Okay, so what's happened to the language since 2005 when Avatar had its debut? Well, there have been some very interesting projects that have included the language. There's just this incredibly wonderful Cirque du Soleil production several years ago based on an Avatar story, and it used a surprising amount of the language. It's visually utterly stunning. There's now a Disney theme park in Orlando, Florida, Pandora, the World of Avatar, where if you visit, you will encounter some of the cast members who will speak some Na'vi to you. There's a pamphlet that is handed to you as a visitor explaining the flora and fauna. And in the lower left corner, there is a set of safety instructions that are bilingual in English and in Na'vi. There's an incredible video game in the works. I'm not sure I'm not sure when it's going to be out, but I've had the pleasure of working on it. But for me, the most exciting and rewarding part of the development of the language has been the emergence of the Litfiaulo, the language community of people who have embraced the language all over the world and really have helped me develop it and use the language for genuine communication, some of whose members are here today. Finally, I cannot fail to mention the fact that there is now a sequel, Avatar 2, Fiaopaia, The Way of Water, and it'll be out only in theaters on December 16th. So with that, I'll say irayo, and be happy to take some questions. Sir.
Hi. So Mark talked about not having expected a language community to emerge, essentially. You made it, it'll be done, moving on. But you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you kind of anticipated that there would be a kind of community that might emerge. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe like considerations of the grammar and things like that. I kind of doubt it, I don't know. But could you talk more about what you were thinking about as you anticipated it these people?
Yeah, well, Mark was the pioneer, okay, and then in 2005 to 2009, Klingon was already a thing. And so I kind of suspected that there would be some people who would be involved in the language. And one of the most astonishing things, this is kind of unbelievable, the movie, first Avatar movie in 2009, in December, came out on a Friday. I think it was on a Thursday, the Thursday before, I received an email, a long email, entirely in Na'vi. And you can imagine my reaction. I said, where the hell did this come from? Well, it turned out that a very early, incomplete version of a glossary had leaked online somehow. And I've been giving a few talks to certain linguistic forums and groups about the structure of the language. Well, several people got together and did their very best to deconstruct the language, and it was remarkably good. It wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably good. And the author of this missive, Britton Watkins, has since become a very close personal friend, and he's still very much involved in the language. So yeah, it's a community that I kind of thought might develop, but it's been a very, very rewarding experience for me to interact with the community. Yeah?
How much did James Cameron affect things in post-production like Oprah?
How much did James Cameron affect things in post-production? I guess I would say that the way he affected things was in his choice of which take of a certain scene would appear in the movie. And there were times when the take that I thought was the absolute best take in terms of the language, because guess what, that's my focus, was not necessarily the take that he would choose, because, hey, the guy's thinking of the acting, the emotion, the choreography, so to speak, the cinematography, everything. And there are a lot of considerations. So if, in fact, a take that he chose wasn't necessarily the one that had the most perfect language, that was it. That was a given. And so, like Mark, I would sometimes have to adapt the language to what emerged. It didn't happen very often, but on occasion it did. Sir?
When you're constructing these languages, do you put any very particular thought from your end about like any gestures and how they convey information, or is that kind of more left to
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get to. Could you repeat it?
when you're making these languages, are you putting particular thought into hand gestures and other body language, or is that more left to the actor?
Yeah, I frankly did not. And that was much more left to the actors and to James Cameron, that sort of thing. I mean, the I see o wangati kame was a gesture that sort of emerged, which fit in perfectly well with the language, but I didn't have anything to do with that. Yeah. Angela.
So speaking of that, how much coaching did you have to do, given especially the adjectives and the sounds in Na'vi, how much coaching did you have to do to the actors?
I was very lucky with Avatar in that I got to work directly with all the actors, and it was great. And there was a fair amount of coaching involved. What I did invariably was provide them with a text with quote-unquote phonetic transcription, was a quasi-Englishy kind of transcription, and then with MP3 recordings. So they had that preliminarily to work on, and then I would always meet with them and help them tweak their pronunciation. Usually it worked out pretty well. I mean, with no exceptions, they all wanted to nail it. And frankly, some had more sort of native talent than others, but it all came out pretty well. Okay, thanks very much.
Great. So thank you so much to our 4 wonderful Conlang creators. And I'd actually like to invite you back up to sit on the panel because we do have a few more questions that we'd like to address to you as a group of panelists. So yeah, if you wouldn't mind taking a seat and grabbing a microphone. Okay, so the first question that I would like to ask the panelists, and you could all sort of take your turn answering it in whichever order you'd like, but a lot of these languages were created either for a different world on a different planet or for a different sort of universe that might resemble Earth but is different in a lot of key ways. And some of these were touched upon in your talks, but how did you navigate these instances of designing a language that is being used to talk about things that are very different from the uses of, for example, English in everyday life? How did you navigate these? How did you come up with words for situations that don't really occur very often in everyday life for us?
I'll say when I worked on a show, and by the way, this microphone is purely for show, so if you but when I was working on a show called Defiance, it took place in America after aliens had crash landed here and had lived here for 40 years. But I always found it very handy that these aliens came from alien worlds when it came to creating new words. Because in English, we have a lot of words that are derived from, based on animals and plants. And I'm not coming up with any. What are some good animal, like I'm thinking about expressions like a fox, but like weaselly or to weasel out of something. What are some other animal ones? Squirrel. Yeah, things like that. And so this was great because anytime I wanted to come up with a new word, I could just invent some animal on these planets that have now been destroyed. Like we weren't going to see them again, so I would just say that this was based on some animal that had these particular characteristics, and then make an adjective based on it. It's great, love
it. For me, actually, it was a reverse problem that was more vexing. Navi is a language spoken in a very special place by very special human-like creatures. But how do you adapt that language to the Earth where people want to use it in Earth-like situations? So, for example, I was mentioning this to a couple of other people. The Navi apparently don't have chairs. I've never seen a chair in the movie. They just sit on rocks, they sit on the floors. So, how do you say chair? And now, should you say chair? There was a contingent early on that said, if this does not exist on Pandora, I don't want a word for it. That would break the purity of the language. And the other group said, no, we want to use the language here. What I wound up doing in that particular situation is take the word for sit, everybody sits, including the Navi, and then add a morpheme that represented the tool for doing something. So a chair became a tool for sitting, that sort of thing. But there was this sort of divergence of opinion early on. Like they were all the people who wanted to use it here on Earth by one hour.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Klingon had the same consideration at the beginning, except that unlike the Navi, the Klingons traveled around all over the place. So even if they didn't have it in their own culture, they might have seen it somewhere else, so they have to find a way to talk about it. One way is to make a word, another way is to borrow, make it be a long word. But initially, as I said, it was only the words that were in the script, so I didn't have to think about that at the outset. So the kind of thing that changed over time, though, is that if you looked up Klingon language in Wikipedia, one of the things they used to say is the vocabulary of Klingon is very restricted and is more ideal for outer space travel. It is than practical everyday concerns. For example, there's a word for bridge, like bridge on it.
I don't know. It is very addictive, isn't it, to just have the microphone. I don't know if it counts as version, but I do know like one set of considerations that we've had to deal with, and that you've had somewhat as well, because sometimes words were given to you that you were like, well, I have to do something with this in the language. But we have worked on projects that were based on books that used entire sentences of the Conlang, and so like having to essentially figure out how it would make sense for these sentences to have meanings, and what we wanted to do with the Conlang, which meant sometimes doing some creative things with like pulling words apart in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think about doing, because you wanted these meaningful components to work out. And so I think that played a role. Otherwise, version-wise, I don't know that we, like once we actually, send it out to the actors, well, we sure hope that's the final version, because that's what it's going to be based on. And so I don't know that there are any other versions beyond that that we have.
I'll just say that the translations by the end of the first season are usually a lot better than they are at the beginning of the first season, especially when we haven't been given a lot of time. For example, like that wasn't a joke. When we did Minishe for Motherland Fort Salem, we had 10 days exactly.
Yeah.
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 Version history.
Yeah. For Navi,
it works.
What?
The microphone.
It worked? Okay. Well, for Navi, I wouldn't say it went through different versions, but there were definitely things that got sort of tweaked along the way. And I must say that this is one of the places that the language community has helped me. I mean, I think I did a pretty decent job, but there are certain things that you don't anticipate, and there are times when I would get a very, very polite note saying, Paul, you just used this particular form in a recent blog post, but 6 years ago, in an earlier post, you said that you couldn't do that, and now you're doing this. And my response was, "Thank you. You're absolutely right." That was an earlier version of the language. It was a fossilized form, which is no longer in use. And just go by what I just said.
Does mine work as well?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I would say that what I've learned as a result of this conlanging adventure, but Klingon and some other things too, but just let's talk about Klingon, is I've developed a skill called retconning. And I think that I've improved most in that regard than in some linguistic stuff. Yeah, there's stuff comes back to haunt.
Thank you very much. So for the next question, one of the themes that we've been talking about and exploring today, and in this department generally, is just the diversity in human languages. And any natural language has a variety of different dialects, different accents, just variation within the language. So how have you managed to take ideas like that about the diversity within a language into Conlang creation?
To a very minimal extent, we were able to do that in Motherland, and that's because in the final season, they wanted an older form of the language to appear, so we were able to showcase how it would have sounded hundreds of years before the earlier episodes. So that was exciting. And then we also had, in the first season, a situation where non-native speakers were trying to speak the language, and so we were able to create sort of a second language learner version of the language in terms of like what we thought that they would get right or what they would struggle with in the language. And so that was pretty exciting, but like we don't normally get a lot of opportunities for that. However, I know David has on other shows.
It really depends on the script and the world a lot of times, because often, especially if what you're essentially doing is a language for the monster of the week, whether it's in a movie or a show, you're getting the language spoken by one, maybe two characters who have pretty much the same background. and are honestly shouting most of the time. So there's just not much opportunity to showcase a lot of like intralinguistic diversity. But every so often you get to, and Defiance was a really great project, just a wonderful project that, you know, that was snake bit from the get-go, as they were trying to do like a video game and a show at the same time, and a game by a company that nobody'd heard of. All due respect, Tryon Worlds, but that was really wonderful because then you had many different alien languages, and you had adult native speakers who were learning English as a second language. They had children who grew up bilingual, and then of course there were also human beings who learned these languages as second languages. And then of course the aliens themselves learned each other's languages as second languages, either before they came to Earth or after. So there was a lot of fun to be had there. That was the only show that I can think of where I actually did a lot of work borrowing words, not just from English into my languages, but from my languages back into English. And so there were so many opportunities in like every episode to do all these interesting things with different languages. But then it's like, you know, then you also have Thor: The Dark World, where there were two characters that spoke it. Both of them were dead by the end of it. And there wasn't an opportunity to do really anything interesting in that regard. You know?
Well, for Klingon, I could think of two kinds of things. One is in Star Trek VI, there is a scene where they speak a different dialect of Klingon. A lot of people come up to me, why are those actors so bad when they speak Klingon? They're not bad, they're intentionally speaking a different dialect. And I've talked about and sketched, but not fully developed, you know, 3 or 4 other dialects, so we know there's dialects around. Klingons are supposed to be the Klingon Empire. There's supposed to be a whole bunch of folks speaking different languages, different dialects, all that stuff. So there's hints about that, but again, I'm not a Star Trek writer, so I didn't do much except for say, yeah, that's true, and here's sort of maybe how it works. The other thing I thought of in terms of David, you made me think of it in terms of the learning as a second language and stuff like that. When I worked with Christopher Plummer on Star Trek VI, he said to me, all right, let's work on this Klingon language a lot. He says, I should be able to speak this language really fluidly. If I'm having, because that's my first language, if I'm having trouble with the language, it should be with English, his character, his Klingon character. I thought that was exactly the right approach. The reverse of that was working with David Warner, who played an Earth guy, all right? He played a British guy in Star Trek V. He only had to say one line in Klingon. Actually, I think it was even just one word in Klingon. And he said, okay, let's work on it. He says, now, I want you to teach me how to say it poorly. And I said, why? He said, us Brits are notoriously bad at foreign languages.
So in Avatar, there was very little linguistic diversity. Everyone essentially spoke the same version of the language. However, there are 4 sequels planned. One is coming out next month, and hopefully there will be 3 others. And it's certainly not impossible that at some point in the franchise, we will meet other tribes, other groups of people living on Pandora who might possibly speak a different dialect of Na'vi. Not impossible.
Thank you so much for those answers. So for the last question that I'll ask before we turn it over to a few more audience questions is, could you each share a phrase in a Conlang that you created, what that phrase means and what it means to you, and maybe something interesting about its etymology or phonology for any Conlang?
Well, the one I always remember that I really enjoy from High Valyrian, because it was kind of the revelation that Daenerys spoke High Valyrian, was Zaldriz es Budarrik Sodaor, which was fun because it was a dragon is not a slave, but I was able to do some fun things with it because ordinarily you would expect the High Valyrian word for slave to be used, which was dohairiros, which was probably a good thing I didn't use that one because it has 2 trills right after one another. She wouldn't have got that, but I used a different word, buzdari, because it came from in the context of the show, it came from the old Giscari language, because the version of Valyrian that was spoken in Slaver's Bay was spoken by former Giscari speakers who had brought in a lot of vocabulary from their language, and so they just used the Giscari word for slave. And so I had Daenerys borrow it into High Valyrian for this sentence in particular, so that it would be very clear to the person that she was talking to, the guy who thought that she didn't speak this language, that not only did she speak Valyrian, but she spoke his version of Valyrian as well and understood everything he'd been saying, because up until that point, he'd just been insulting her left and right, and his translator had been massaging it for him. And he just assumed that he could get away with that, and she wanted to make sure that he knew, before he got burnt to a crisp, that she knew.
So in Méniché, we have the phrase "lo wi me wela," and that translates as "I love you," but it literally means "you are my song," because the witches have like these special powers that are related to what they call songs or seeds, which are very powerful things they do with their voice. And so we decided that would be the most intimate thing you could say to somebody else if you were a speaker of that language.
For Navi, I would have to say that it's the sentence, I love you, which comes out as ngayaw na luwer, literally, you, beloved, are to me. And very early on after the movie came out, I got a request of, please write that down for me because I want to have it tattooed on my arm.
Yeah, tattoos are quite a thing. I'm in the process of finalizing, not for me, but for somebody else. If it's this, you put it in a movie, who cares? You know, but put it on your skin. I'm going to cheat, okay, and not give a phrase, but just give a word, because when I was working on Klingon on the first film, which is the third film, I was wondering, is there going to be a word that people are going to recognize as Klingon, even if you don't know anything about the language, really? Okay, is there going to be a nanu, you know, kind of thing, if anyone knows what that is, if you're old enough. And there is, you know, and the word is kapla, which is the word everyone knows. And you go around and people say cropla and crepla. It got out there somehow. Yeah.
What does it mean?
Success. People think it means hello, goodbye, or something like that. It doesn't. It means success. It's when you're going off on a mission. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing those. Now I think we have time for a couple of audience questions. So if anyone didn't get a chance to get their question in, now is your chance. Yes?
So I'm curious about language regulations. So when you meet your demise, whether untimely or not, who's going to be in charge of your language and making sure that the community has sort of an authoritative source for new words, new grammatical constructions, etc.
I have a pretty strong opinion about this, so I want to say that, and I want to say it in this context. At the second language creation conference, which was in 2007 in Berkeley, and in fact, Erica was there, and that was where we met the first time. David Sallow came and spoke there, and I was looking things up, and you know, he worked as the translator for Tolkien's languages for the films, for the Lord of the Rings films. And I found it very disappointing and honestly just baffling that there was a strong and negative reaction within the Tolkien language community online about his work as a translator on the movies, because not every single word that was used in the movies were ones that Tolkien had come up with. And their opinion was like, you can't even call this Sindarin. It's not the same thing. It's some bizarre Frankenstein thing. And I thought it was just so ridiculous, because a language, whether it's created or not, a language has two states. Either it's alive or it's dead, and that's it. Like at some point in time, yeah, we're all going to be dead. But it's like basically at that point, then the language is just left. And so honestly, the question is, you know, who's the authority on it? Well, this isn't a flippant answer. The question is, who cares, right? And really all you have to do, in my opinion, is just tag it. It's like, all right, these are all the words, for example, that I came up with for High Valyrian. When I die at some point, if some other people come up with some words, like, all right, these are the ones that they came up with. Do you like them? Then use them. Do you not like them? Then don't. And really, then it's just like, all right, well, whatever, the language just splits. I don't think it hurts anything to have other people come up with words. And it's like, if the majority decide they don't like it, then they don't use it. But the same thing happens with the languages we speak. The same thing happens with English. If the majority don't like the words, then they don't get repeated. People don't learn them and they don't use them. It doesn't hurt the English language. Same thing with ours, I think.
I thought we had the understanding I was the authority over all your languages. Things change, I guess.
When it comes to it's a good question. I have not designated any successor, so to speak. I mean, for better or worse, I'm the gatekeeper. I'm the one who decides what's in and what's not. There are a number of people in the Navi language community who know the language so well that they could actually take over. How that person would be chosen, or whether it should be a person, or maybe it should be the equivalent of what someone was talking about, like an academy, the Navi Language Academy. That remains to be determined.
I'd say ditto. Yeah, same thing for Klingon. The way Klingon is going, it's the speakers who are going to be these people, this academy, whatever it is. What form that takes, what the organization is, who's who, who's in, who's out. I don't know, but they're the ones using the language. They get to deal with it. I don't care, at that point.
All right, we have time for one final question for our panelists. Let's see, who hasn't gotten a chance to ask a question yet? Maybe over there?
How did you find yourselves in this line of work?
Well, mine is perhaps the easiest and shortest answer. I met David.
Specifically, I ran a competition because I wanted to work with somebody to create the language for Motherland Fort Salem, and there were a lot of people that applied, and I reviewed their applications. I interviewed 5 of them, and Jessie was the best, and she's incredible. So, but you also were a language creator already. She'd been a language creator for longer than I had. For myself, I also came by way of a competition. The Language Creation Society put together a competition to create Dothraki for Game of Thrones, and so I and many other language creators competed for it, and I won it. And so that was that.
Were you the judge as well?
No, I had to recuse myself. Yeah, actually, the first round was judged by other language creators, the second round by the producers. It was a flawed competition. We could talk about that later if we want.
For me, the very short answer is that there was a job opening, I applied for it, and I got it. The more interesting, somewhat longer answer is, this is back in 2005. I have a PhD in linguistics, but I was actually teaching at USC in the business school. I was teaching in the Center for Management Communication, and I did not have any direct connection with the linguistics department, which is where I got my degree from. But out of some alignment of the stars, a good friend of mine in the department, a guy named Ed Finnegan, who was a former professor of mine, who became a mentor and, in fact, my co-author on this linguistic workbook looking at languages. He noticed an email that had come to the linguistics department at USC, where James Cameron's production company, Lightstorm, was looking for a linguist who could develop a language for a science fiction film. At the time, it was known as Project 880. And so Ed forwarded the email to me and said, I think this kind of sounds like you. So I looked at it and said, yeah, that definitely sounds like me. So I applied for the job. I sent Cameron a copy of our workbook. A couple weeks later, I get a call, why don't you come in and talk to Jim? So I had this incredible 90 minutes in his private office, and he told me about his vision for the language. It apparently went pretty well. Stood up, shook my hand, and said, welcome aboard. And my life has not been the same ever since.
Well, I got tapped for Klingon because I did Vulcan before that. I got tapped, so that's easy. I got tapped for Vulcan I mean, there's a story, but the very short version is luck. I was in LA. I had some spare time, which I hadn't counted on. I got together with a friend. My friend happened to be working at Paramount. Her boss happened to be Harv Bennett, who was a producer of Star Trek II. During lunch, they told me they needed a linguist. I thought that was great. Go off and they were going to hire a linguist from UCLA. They had trouble linking up with the linguist from UCLA, and they said they needed this done right away. I said, how long? What do you mean right away? We need it done this week, which is how long I was in town. I volunteered, and now I'm here.
All right, thank you so much for your very insightful answers to these questions. Thank you so much to our creators. So this concludes our segment with the Conlang creators, and we do have a second segment with Conlang researchers who are doing language research. In between, we're going to have a break, but during the break, there will be an opportunity to participate in a trivia game where you can test your knowledge of 3 different languages: Esperanto, Na'vi, or Klingon. So if you are interested in the trivia, you are welcome to stay here. The first Conlang researcher talk begins at 4:10, which is in 30 minutes. So if you participate in the trivia, that shouldn't take more than about 15, 20 minutes. So you'll still have time to get in a break. So if you would like to participate in the trivia, anyone can do it. All you need is a device with an internet connection. Then please stay in the room, and we'll get started in just a minute.
And there will be prizes eventually.
Oh yes, there will be prizes for the winners. And while we're getting started, I will say the prizes, well, in order to get the prize, you have to pass 2 steps. So the first step is to be a finalist from the trivia. And then the top 2 performers from this trivia game for each language will then be asked a question by the creator of that language, except for Esperanto, because that wouldn't be possible. I will be cosplaying Zamenhof today. And then the winner of that question, whoever answers that question first, and that'll be later, that'll be after the researcher talks, will then win the top prize for that language. Okay, raise your hand if you are in the room for the Esperanto quiz. Okay, I think that's all the people we're going to get, so we're just going to get you started, and then we'll do the other 2 languages in just a second. Okay, there are 18 people are doing Esperanto. Wow, 19. Okay, great. So we are going to get started. It will be on your devices, so you do not need to look at the screen. The screen will show the leaderboard, but all the questions will be on your device. Okay, ready, set, and now we'll get started with Na'vi. Okay, so if you would like to join Na'vi while the Esperanto players are getting started, please join use this join code to enter the game room. We can check on the leaderboard for Esperanto. Okay. We've got some solid competition going. All right, we have 7 people in for Na'vi. So I think we're just going to get started, unless anyone needs a minute. Oh, you need a minute? Okay. You'll get Klingon. In just a minute, we'll get started with Klingon. Oh, okay. Okay, in the meantime, I can also show the Klingon trivia. So if you want to play Klingon, you can join. Here, I'll split screen it so that you can see both. Oh no. Which one did I just do? Yes. Left is Na'vi, yep. Yeah, so join myquiz.com and then enter these codes. The left is for Na'vi and the right is for Klingon. Okay, we have 10 players on the left, so yeah, that's the Na'vi room, and we have 8 players for Klingon. Does anyone need a bit more time to join? Almost there? Okay.
There you go. I see you. Yeah.
No.
Okay, we're going to have to get started, so. All right, we are starting Na'vi and.
Do we have questions for
Yes, there are, yeah. The questions won't appear on the screen. You have to join on your device. But I think it's a bit unfair if the creator participates in the trivia, though.
I'm in the lead. Oh, lost it.
So you might be able to tell from the names on the leaderboard which language it is.
Is actually the way.
What is it?
I think one of I guess we,
Oh, they're not in the. Oh, it's a live stream. That's how there's so many players. I was wondering how so many people suddenly joined. Is that allowed? Do they still get a prize? Or? Okay. Some people didn't participate, but is anyone still going? Okay, so I think we're going to end the games. And we have a list of the winners, so we're going to screenshot that for later. So I'm going to end these. Okay, so we will make note of the top 2 winners, and then after the research talks, we will invite the top 2 finalists from each language up to hear a question from the Conlang creator. Except for Esperanto. And then we will still ask a question, it just won't be from the creator. And then the winner will get a special prize, and the second place will also get a runner-up prize. Meanwhile, anyone who participated is welcome to come get a sticker from our Duolingo sponsor, they sponsored us in the sense of sending us these wonderful Duolingo stickers. So. Okay, if you are one of the top 2 as shown on this screen, could you just step aside over here so we know who you are? If you're one of the top 2 players from the language, each language?
Hello there.
Hello, you are Jacob? Okay, but what is your username?
Awe.
Okay, great.
Great.
Okay, so.
This is T-Ret.
Okay, great. Can I just write down your names? Okay, so we will now be hearing from a series of, thank you, of Conlang researchers, or language researchers generally. They don't necessarily all exclusively study Conlangs, but language generally, with relevant interests that line up with constructed languages. But first, we'll be hearing from Damian Blasi. So Damian is a postdoctoral researcher at the Culture, Cognition, and Coevolution Lab at Harvard, just up the street, and a Harvard Data Science Initiative Fellow. He studies the relationship between human cognition and linguistic diversity, with interests that include the emergence of new languages and cross-linguistic patterns. So Damian's hopefully going to have some very insightful things to say as it pertains to constructed languages. So without further ado, we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much, Saima, Elise, Ev. This has been amazing. I mean, I would say for the last 2 years, it has been the most cool conference I've been to. So thanks a lot. And it's a tall order, right? Because from now it's going to be like, okay, don't expect what you just seen. And I am the least cool of all of you because I am the only one who actually hasn't done any research on Conlangs. I work on linguistic diversity, broadly defined, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And I just want to situate you a little bit on the type of research and the science I produce. And I have to say that whatever I do hasn't been possible because it became possible because of developments in the last 20 years. And there's 3 very important factors that have played out in the way in which me and others study the languages of the world. So first of all, we have now massive amounts of digitalized data from many different languages. We have speech samples, we have Wikipedia dumps, we have corpora from many, many different languages that we didn't have access to, just as I said, 10, 20 years back. Second, we have in consequence, a number of computational methods that allow us to take all of that mass of data and learn and make inferences about the languages of the world. And finally, and to my mind/heart, this is the most important component of this approach to linguistic diversity, which is it's very interdisciplinary. So the study of linguistic diversity is not anymore the private turf of linguists. Now they are evolutionary biologists, they are anthropologists, cognitive neuroscientists, and a long, etc. So it's very exciting. We're still trying to come up with a common vocabulary about how to talk about these things. And I hope you'll see some of this in the next few slides. And what I'm going to do is I will tell you some, I'm going to be glossing over all details, of course, but I'm going to be telling you about some findings that I think ask us to rethink what we think is the science space of language. And because I'm very narcissistic, I'm going to cite my own work, but there's a lot of excellent work by much better people than me, but still, this is representative. So let's start with something very straightforward. If you ever get to open a Linguistics 101 textbook, at some point, you're going to find this claim that there is no necessary connection between how you name something and the thing itself. It doesn't matter how you call a bird, water, a dog, whatever. It's just a convention, and there's nothing necessary about how you call it. And of course, this is trivially true. We can just come up with a new language, and we can use any word or name that we want for that. That's perfectly fine. But I think the true underlying question here is not whether languages can have this arbitrary relation between form and meaning, but whether there actually are. And historically, what happened is that a linguist will go check a bunch of different words from different languages for the same referent, like in this case, where you have nose in 9 different languages. You take a look around and say, well, actually, there doesn't seem to be anything in common between those, so there's nothing really going on. But once you are able, through computational methods, to ask more precise questions about subtle patterning between form and meaning, you end up finding a bunch of different, very clear emerging results. And I choose nose because I know it's nose, nasal consonants, it makes sense, and some people have proposed that this makes sense indeed. But we have studied a large number of words in basic vocabulary in many different languages, and we find that in about 50% of all the hundreds of words that we have studied, we find robust convergence in form and meaning. So even if human languages can be absolutely arbitrary when it comes to form-meaning associations, they are not most of the time. Then there's something that is perhaps a bit more arcane, but it's very close to my heart. And this has to do with this idea that has been going on for 150 years, that there has been no substantive change in the nature of languages now in relation to the past. So if you look around languages, there are relative clauses, determiners, leviatantals, whatever, you name it, then there's no good reason to think that any of those things were absent in the past, or that there's stuff that existed in the past and doesn't exist now. So there's a bit of a continuity. Now, for anyone who has done any research on any aspect of humans for more than 5 years or something like that, if you look at the long scale of time, one very obvious thing is that humans have changed dramatically. And I'm singling out there the Holocene, which was this period of time, the last 12,000 years, where we went from living in small hunter-gatherer societies, eating mostly food that was available, to living in huge urban setups, and human biology, human culture, human morality have changed enormously. But we still have this assumption that languages actually have remained exactly the same, at least in this broad description. Now, I think at this point we have enough evidence to realize that this is not true. Let me give you a very superficial demonstration of that. One very well-established change that paleoanthropologists have established in this period of time, the Holocene, is that there has been a global and asynchronous change in the shape of the human bite. So if you ever go to a natural history museum and you see human remains from the early Holocene, you will see that the bite is such that upper teeth and lower teeth are in perfect occlusion. Now, I guess most of us here in this audience, you're going to find that the upper teeth, your upper teeth, produce an angle in relation to the lower teeth. And you might ask, okay, yeah, that's nice, but who cares? And the things that you might not care, But if you want to produce a labiodental sound, which in English are sounds like F and V, this makes a world of difference. And again, I'm not giving you any of the details, but in our study, we have linked these changes in human bite over the last 12,000 years to what I think it's a pretty impressive finding, which is that most likely 12,000 years back, no human languages have labiodentals. The sounds F and B didn't exist. But now, these speech sounds are present in about half of the world's languages. So there has been a dramatic change in what we can or we can expect around the languages of the world. Something more, something that links language with the broader human spectrum. And I think we have learned lots about this in the last 10 years. There has been a lot of study on how is that languages are being co-transmitted with aspects of culture and also with aspects of human biology, including the genomes. And there is this well-established finding from the 90s that if you look at the history of different populations from the point of view of genetics, and you compare that with the linguistic history of populations, they're pretty much the same. There is a bit of a mirror situation. And most of the initial papers that established that relation were strongly based in Europe and Eurasia more in general. But more recently, and wow, something happened with that font. What's that? Wow. In a few weeks, you're going to see a paper where we take a much broader sample of languages and genomes of populations of the world. And what we find is that actually the European and Eurasian case was the exception. And most of the time, in most of history, even before European colonialism, languages and genes go in perfectly independent ways. So people mingle together. Sometimes they pass languages, sometimes genes, sometimes both, sometimes none. So it seems that chaos has been the guiding force of the evolution of languages and genomes in this regard. Okay, so I'm really hopeful that we'll keep finding very cool aspects of language that speak directly to what a language is. But there is also reason to be a bit cautious in the sense that most of the most well-studied languages are very few. I'm using a figure of 100 here. I'm being super optimistic. Like anyone that has done any real research on language knows that I'm being super, super optimistic here. But we should keep in mind that there's about 7,000 languages out there. And one very important thing to mention is that there is also a practical side to increasing the representation and the data and the studies of languages beyond the handful of languages that have been studied very well. So most obvious of those have to do, for instance, with the fact that if you have more data for more languages, it's easier to come up with more efficient language technologies, which are fundamental in most contemporary societies. Think about speech recognition, think about machine translation, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think you'll be surprised if I told you that still to this day, most development in language technologies are monopolized by just 20 languages. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that this is going to change rapidly for the next few years. Now, there is another reason that, again, I shouldn't use this expression close to my heart twice in a talk. Someone told me that many years back, and now I'm doing it. Okay, but there is another reason that I think is extremely important. And for that, I need to refer to this problem that has become very fashionable in the last 10 years. And that has to do with the observation that when we think about the subjects that have been the base of our science of human behavior and human cognition, we're not just sampling randomly from the humans that exist in the world, but instead we're picking on a very specific type of human, in particular undergrads in wealthy universities. So, these individuals belong to societies that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, hence the acronym WEIRD. And this is a big problem because it's not just they come from a particular type of society, but there is very reliably consequences of growing up in such society and all sorts of aspects of the human mind, like your moral judgments, how you categorize things, even how you interact with visual illusions. Now, I think you know where I'm going with this. Yes, not only most humans that have been studied in psychology and behavioral sciences come from weird societies, but they also, most of the time, speak English. And again, as there is a strong, important difference in the type of societies that weird societies are in relation to other societies, there's important differences in English when you compare English with all languages of the world. And I think now it's reasonable to ask, well, if weird societies have an effect and might compromise our capacity to generalize findings beyond humans that belong to societies, can we make the same inference in relation to speakers of English? And this has been a very controversial topic, but more recently, my collaborators and I have the opinion that in 2022, there is enough evidence to suggest that there is a non-trivial connection between at least certain aspects of cognition and the language one signs or speaks. Of course, it doesn't determine how you think or anything like that. Some effects are very subtle and very small, but they are there. Now, I know that I should have, like, you're handling that 1 minute. I would say it's 1 minute and 30. Clearly, the takeaway message is very straightforward. If we really want to have a science of human cognition and human behavior that truly encompasses all humans, then we have to take into account the fact that there are all of those languages out there. Now, very briefly, I want to say this super briefly. Like, okay, what? 3 minutes. Oh, wow, I was about to rush. Wow. All right, I'll just drink some water. I was rushing. Wow. Whew. All right. So I have a story. Something like this happened in a job interview, which was terrible. Now it's all laughs. It's great. So there's this thing that even if we are extremely optimistic and we manage to get data and analysis and studies with all 7,000 languages out there, there's still something we are missing. And I know this is a poorly defined concept. Just go with me with this. We are missing the space of possible languages, not the languages that happen to exist, but languages that could have existed and could have happily exist as natural languages. And I guess you know where I'm going with this. If you agree with us on that the relation between language and cognition and maybe other aspects of behavior is non-trivial, there is something going on there, then looking at these possible languages are very far from the languages we know is extremely interesting and a very important step forward in understanding what it means to be a human or to have a human cognition. So, if you haven't read this amazing book, we'll just be hearing more about. You should, but there is a lot. Great, I see it. I'm going to get my autograph immediately after I stop with my presentation. But what I was going to say is that in the Conlang community, there have been many attempts of coming up with languages that are explicitly engineered in order to produce a specific cognitive result, or testing hypotheses about how humans think, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the motivation, it's great. It aligns perfectly with the way we think. But there is a number of technical problems with the approaches. It seems that most of the outcomes of these Conlang experiments that aim at testing the relation between language and cognition have been limited a bit by the lack of proper experimental designs and way of keeping track of information or learning, et cetera, et cetera. This is boring, but I'm just putting this because I think one of the most interesting outcomes, apart from the main study that we are running here, or they are running here, is that I would love that we get to talk more. That we, people working with languages and thinking of very different languages, get to talk with Conlang creators. So that's it. Thank you. Wow, it was beautiful. I spent so much time choosing the font. But anyhow, yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. And it's Arial. You know, if it was Verdana or something like that, but it's just as horrible.
So you said that there's evidence that languages can possibly influence some areas of cognition, but how do you distinguish between languages themselves influencing areas of cognition versus that which is culturally transmitted through languages? Because it seems like the vast majority of cultural transmission happens within languages for the simple reason that if you speak a language, you have access to the great, fire hose of everything said and written and so on in it, whereas if you don't, then you only have access to the relative trickle that's translated. So, again, so how do you distinguish, that influence of the language itself versus the influence of something that's transmitted culturally using the language?
This is a very, very difficult question, and in many cases we are unable to distinguish between the two, right? You, as I was mentioning before, you don't receive just your language in isolation. You get norms, culture, beliefs, even genes in some situations. So sometimes it's absolutely impossible to tell one from the other. I think that what one could do, though, is to increase the feasibility of a given account. So if I'm telling you that there is a particular aspect of a language that has a specific cognitive effect that is plausible in the context of what we know in cognitive science, then you're doing well there. Doesn't mean that it's going to be right, but I think that's a way forward. Am I regulating this? I have to decide? No, don't make me decide, please. I feel like guilty. It's like, who was first there? Whoever was first, yes.
Okay. How much thinking has your research team done about the idea of an optimal language for human functioning? As an example, let us say that being able to perform well in advanced physics is a very admirable human trait, something that would encourage that sort of thinking maximally while under the constraint that they still can function with everyday things in a relaxed manner. I mean, how much have you thought about things like that?
Let me put it like this. I work on the description and the understanding of these patterns, but the engineering part, that is a completely different monster. And I want to be very cautious before saying anything that has to do with what I think would, yeah. Thank you. Yep.
So you said there are about 7,000 languages or so. When you're talking about that, most of it are dialects or languages, and where do you draw the line?
Excellent. So we are, right now, I'm working with UNESCO, with the United Nations, and we are trying to come up with a way of having some type of rule to determine the difference between a language variety and it's a very hard problem. I was talking with some of you before that you might think this is just an innocuous decision. It's like, oh, you know, if there is, I mean, sometimes people throw the rule 70% intelligibility, which, what does it mean? On which set of communicative intentions, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, you might think you can just use any of those rules, but in actuality, what happens is that those decisions end up having an impact on people's rights sometimes. Like, for instance, there are some governments that provide specific funds to speakers of small minority languages. So what happens if you're just speaking a big language, or you're just a very special variety of that big language? So we don't know. The difference between dialect and language is one of those that it's not entirely scientific, and it keeps coming up. I would like to understand better why is it so appealing. Yeah.
Amongst a set of possible languages is a very small subset of useless languages, which is always something that's interested me, because there are languages, for example, every language that I know of has been designed to be useful. Even the ones that we speak are, you know, unconsciously designed to be useful, but even something like Ithkuil was designed to be useful. But I'll give you an example of a theoretical language that has a really, truly useless feature. So, like, languages will distinguish, like, singular from plural, or singular from dual from plural. Some may be singular from trial from plural. But there is a possible language that distinguishes singular from plural, but has a very special morphological form for exactly 17 of something as well. And perhaps it's a very irregular form. And I always wondered, well, if you, for the purposes of experimentation, if you design these really useless languages, or languages with really useless features, what would it mean to learn that? And, like, could they even be retained for long? Not being eroded.
Well, so I would say that most, I don't know how to regulate this. Most natural languages are full of garbage. There's a lot of stuff, seriously, there is a lot of stuff about natural languages that is not really playing a very active functional role. And we humans are Of course, I'm a human, so what do you expect? We humans are extremely smart animals. We can learn very complicated systems that might not be extremely optimized for doing exactly that task. And many times you might just conserve a bunch of these markers that might just have lost all their function because they provide you with, social signaling, or because you're a smart human, you learn it and it stays there. So I'm sure that we can produce languages that are much worse than having a specific marking for 17, and still, my prediction is we are going to thrive.
When you're looking at the speakers of the language, are you looking at more specific levels of comprehension? So I'm thinking about there's been a lot of money put into by the Welsh government into schools to have kids that maybe speak Welsh at home also be learning Welsh in schools, so therefore there are more Welsh speakers in general. So you're looking at difference of like someone who only speaks the language at home and then maybe speaks something else in their everyday life, someone who speaks it at home and also learning it at school and using it in everyday life, and then someone who is just picking up the language. Maybe like I took Spanish in high school, I didn't speak Spanish at home. Are you looking at those different levels of comprehension when you're looking at speakers, or is that just going to make things like quite messy and complicated?
So I have to confess something, that is, most of my research is observational. Like I got into the study of linguistic diversity by just essentially poaching beautiful data sets that other linguists have put together. And it's like, it was only very recently, I think like 4 years back, that I got into a laboratory and, start playing around with experiments. But but in a few years, hopefully, I'll be able to tell you something more. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Damian, for that really fascinating look at linguistic diversity. So next up, we have Erica Okrent, who is a linguist and a writer, whose book was just featured in Damian's talk as well. So she is the author of In the Land of Invented Languages, which is all about conlangs and the history of constructed languages, as well as being the author of numerous articles for both scientific and popular audiences about language and related topics. So without further ado, Erica, thank you so much.
Great. It's so great to be here. It's great to be anywhere. I'm so glad we can go places again. And so, yeah, it was definitely, I'm up for it. Like, invite me somewhere, I'll go. It's great to be here. And this is such an interesting kind of full circle moment for me personally. My contribution here is the history of invented languages. That's my research here. And I realized being here that I started this project in earnest 20 years ago. The book came out, it took me a while, and then the book came out. But it was while I was working on my dissertation and I was procrastinating and didn't want to work on that. I wanted to flip through books in the library and read about all these projects and what happened with them. But my dissertation was an fMRI experiment, and I didn't continue along that path. I mean, it was about English verbs, just plain old vanilla language. But that's where I did this fMRI experiment, and at the time, no one could ever have imagined that there would be any place for Esperanto in there or Klingon. That would have been considered a ridiculous proposition. Another part of this 20-year circle, when I did start in earnest, is because I came to a Esperanto Congress, the North American Esperanto Conference, whatever, was here at MIT. An MIT student had organized it, and that was my first contact with like a living constructed language community, and now I'm here, and there's an fMRI experiment, and it's strange. And that at that event, I had studied a little. I was in the first talk or whatever in the room, and I looked over and I saw a professor from my linguistics department. I guess is that yeah, that's Howie Aronson. He was like the Georgian professor. And I had no idea that he was an Esperantist. And he wasn't trying to hide it or anything. It wasn't something we talked about in linguistics. It wasn't something that linguists were curious about or interested in scientifically. And at this time, the second half of the 20th century, linguistics was doing a lot. It was a little insecure about being a science and was very, we're not talking about that. That is kind of insulting that you even bring it up, because it'd be kind of like if you're an astronomer or something and then someone marches into the room like, I think if the world were flat, things would work a lot better, don't you think? And then, everyone turns to look at them and, how very dare you? We are scientists here, and what are you trying to do? And that was kind of the reaction to invented languages in linguistics. But even before, even when we weren't trying to be scientists and it was, solidly in humanities, there was, again, this kind of insult to bringing up invented languages in the field. And when I went and bought a copy of the Klingon dictionary at the bookstore, I handed it over to the clerk, and they picked it up and looked at it and said, I hate the fact that this exists. And it was this feeling of like insulting language, like the fact that this exists in a bookstore where we have literature and beauty and history, and this is an insult. And that was the attitude about invented languages. But that has changed a lot. And this history of invented languages has gone on since the book came out, and things have really changed. So it's interesting for me to look at. And I'm going to quickly go through the history of invented languages to get us to where we are today with some words from languages. So the first one that we have documentation for, I'm pretty sure people have been doing this for as long as they've had the idea that what we're doing is language. Humans are natural engineers. They want to make things more optimal, make things better. I'm sure people have been inventing languages longer than this, but the first documentation we have is of the Lingua Ignota of Hildegard of Bingen from the 12th century. And this is a word from her language, Oirunguizol, and it means earwax, which is strange because people, was this a secret language for her nuns? Was it something spiritual? Was it something metaphysical? And it seems from the vocabulary that she made, it was really her way of just making the world in the way she wanted to see it. It's got word for earwax. It's got word for saucepan and jokester and barley and really quotidian things in her world. She wanted to make a vocabulary that felt right to her. Then we don't know why, we don't have documentation about her purposes or anything like that, but to me, looking at it now, this looks like an artistic conlang. That's the first one we have evidence for, and then we have various things happening after that, but it doesn't really pick up again until the 17th century. We get a new age of language invention with a very particular kind of purpose. What had happened in the years leading up to this was the invention of mathematical notation, which was, it seems it's such a normal part of our world now, but people used to do mathematical explanation in blocks of text. If you look at the old mathematical works are like blocks of Latin text explaining, take this from that and intersect this with that, and it's very hard to follow, it's confusing. And the invention of mathematical notation made it clearer that now here comes the invention of calculus. Everything was opened up by this. And it also made it seem it's universal, right? You don't have to, it doesn't matter what your language is or spoken language is, mathematical notation works for everybody. So people got the idea well, let's do that for everything. And a whole bunch of languages come out based on numbers, or this idea that we could kind of put all concepts into a math of some kind, and then we could see the truth of everything if we just get the notation right. And so this is one universal character from Cave Beck from 1657. And what he did was assign a number to every idea, every concept, but it's all in alphabetical order. So it's like 1, abandon, 2, abate, 3, abash, which means he could get a sentence like honor thy father and mother. You could speak it. This would be pronounced leb tore onfo, pi tofo sensen, et pif tofo sensen. So you can see it's got, the P stands for personal noun. The F is like the female version of the personal noun. So all you need is that one number. It's got a little bit of breaking down of concepts, but you can't do operations with this. Like if you can't add these numbers together, you can't do anything with these numbers. It's not a system that operates in any way. But this idea really took hold, and there were many attempts at this kind of language. And they didn't go very far until a real character in philosophical language of 1668. This was John Wilkins. And this is the word for shit in that language, because I had a dictionary, and what word are you going to look up first? And it's in there because everything in the universe is in there, because what you need to speak the truth and have all concepts broken down into language is a sense of where everything is in this system. And where the pif, tofo, sen, sen, you couldn't do anything operational with that. It wasn't a system. This is a system. So se, the beginning of the word, puts you in the ideas of actions, of motion. The P gets you to motions of purgation. The rest of it takes you through this chart. So you get the purgative motions. They can either be vaporous and windy, or cirrus and watery. And then you go down to where are they coming from? Oh, the consistent and gross parts from the guts upward or downward. And so though each letter there gets you further down the tree until you get to the word for shit and all its 17th century synonyms. So this is an amazing piece of systematic work, but it's really impossible to use. I think maybe a couple letters were written in it, but it's to say anything in this language, you first have to know exactly what you want to say, and we do not speak like that. We don't know exactly what we want to say before we start. But this was the most elaborated version of this kind of language. And this kind of thing continued on. This is from Ruggles, an American Universal Language of 1829, and we're still doing this in 1829, where each letter stands for a part of this meaning here. I don't know how you pronounce this, but this idea wouldn't go away. And until we get to the next phase in the history, which is, so now we're in 1829, now it's the 19th century, and things are changing. We've got people are moving around on the locomotive engine, and there's great nations are dissolving along language lines, and people want to be able to communicate. Enough of this philosophical stuff where we try to get the meaning of everything into a word. We need to talk to each other. And this brings us to Esperanto, which wasn't the first of this kind, but it's the most successful of its kind, and it's the most successful of all the kinds, because it's still around. People speak it quite naturally. They do everything in it. There are native speakers of it. It's a living language. And the idea here is that you make it as easy to learn and as regular as possible. So, mi amas, I love. Mi estas, I am. Mi parolas, I speak. Mi dankas, I thank. Mi havas, I have. And, you got a little bit of English, you got a little bit of Romance, you got a little bit of, different roots together to make it, a little more fair for people. And then you've got the same ending. It's always as, the present tense. And it doesn't change with whether it's me or vi or she or li. It's always the same. You don't have to memorize all these irregular verbs. And this takes off and becomes something that people use. Now, the first type of language, the Wilkins language was, the Royal Society was working on this. People of prestige in high places were interested in this idea. But by the time we got to this one, it was done, and anyone doing it was a nut job. With Esperanto in those years, again, it started off very a respectable, prestigious thing to do. The League of Nations was interested after World War I, like, this might solve some of these problems, let's look into it. But eventually it became something that only eccentrics did. But that's fine. They're still doing it and using it to do everything. So there's been this kind of up and down in invented languages of interesting idea, prestige, and then falling off into like only people who are really into it, still doing it, and actually, but Esperanto was different in that people were actually living it. And that's why it's still around today. Then we took a little backwards. Once Esperanto got to the point where people thought, oh, this is very eccentric, this is very strange, there was a back to this idea, like, we need to be respectable, we need to have something scientific. And Lojban, or Loglan, which was the original version, comes about, which was a scientific experiment, teach people a logical language, see if they think more logically. And here's the word for and in Lojban, because there's a lot of different ways to say and as a logical connector. So you have which is like two propositions happened. So that, like, John and Alice carried the piano means maybe they did it, one did it in 1930, one did it in 1912. I'm not saying anything more than that. I'm just asserting two propositions. Compared with joy, which is like they formed a joint entity and carried the piano. So you have to know exactly which and you mean. And we're kind of back in that same position of like, gotta know exactly what you mean before you can say anything. But people do actually speak this language. It goes very slowly, but it's possible. And then we move to Klingon. This is a line from Hamlet. I think you can tell which one. And now there's no more of this idea of grabbing at prestige or respect. It's doing it because it's interesting and doing it because it's fun. And if you do that, people will still come to it and speak it. This is one of the kippas. I'm over there. You probably recognize some people in this. But this brings about a new kind of freedom with respect to invented language. No more of this fighting for League of Nations to listen to me. This is what we're doing. And you can be far more successful with that. And then we move to this is a picture from the Language Creation Society. I think, yeah, you're in there, David. I don't know if I'm in this picture too. Yeah. Okay, so, and now people are doing it as an art form, doing it for its own sake, and you can still get people to come and grow it and use it. So that is where the history of invented languages leads to, and then that's where the book ends. And this has happened all since the end of that history, and it's still going forward, and people are still using these languages until we get to now this incredible idea that they're doing an fMRI research experiment, and linguists are teaching classes in their colleges about invented languages. We went to that from this, no one wants to hear this, hiding that you even speak Esperanto, not telling your department about it, to the point where it's now something you can use for science and use at this prestigious level without giving up the freedom of saying, hey, I'm doing this because I like it. It doesn't have to be useful for anything, but it can still be useful. So, sorry. All right, that's it.
So we're here from the inventive language class. And we talked a lot about how you can measure the success of inventive language. How do you personally define the success of an inventive language?
How do you what? How do you,
A conlang is successful.
Well, I think, you know, if people are actually using it, that's a big step. Most of the invented languages throughout history, no one has ever used. Even the inventor has never used it. Success can be anyone using it, or it meets your artistic feeling. You know, that this is what I imagine I would like a language to be, and you've created it, and it satisfies your inner aesthetic sense. That's a type of success too. I should say, I forgot to get to this, but having David and Jesse's talk about collaborative conlanging, because the history of invented languages is all individual megalomaniacs doing it, you know, and to think that it could then end up at a spot where you could actually have conlang collaboration, where you could build something with someone else for a purpose that will then go on to do something and be a success in a world that, you know, a few people know about or a big subculture knows about. It doesn't really matter, but it's been creative and it's working and it's going. That's a success. You know.
Based on your research, what do you think are the constructed languages that have the most speakers currently after Esperanto?
After Esperanto?
Obviously Esperanto's
Yeah.
first, but...
Yeah, Esperanto. Yeah, it's hard to say, because then it's like, well, what counts as a speaker? And Esperanto has the advantage of living in the real world in a lot of places. And there's in-person gatherings, a lot of in-person gatherings. And I have seen the in-person gatherings for Klingon and for Lojban, and then I hesitate, because like it's probably happening for Valerian and Dothraki, and I'm doing the thing that I started 20 years ago, and I'm not keeping up with it, so I'm not sure, but yeah, it doesn't have to be a competition. Yeah. All set? Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. I hope it's not too late in the day for neuroscience, but I hope you guys will enjoy learning a little about what we do. So, and there is drinks afterwards, so that's something to look forward to. All right. So I'm going to start by just thanking everybody who made this event possible. This was put together relatively quickly. So thank you very much to our McGovern Institute, first and foremost, Elise Malvicini, who just has been incredible. I don't know if she's still around somewhere, but she was really great. And our director, Bob Desimone, who of course financially supported a lot of this event. And Steve Shannon, who is our operations manager, who makes the scanners work all the time, which is quite a feat on trying to scan 50 people in a weekend, which is it's crazy. It's like certifiably crazy. Then thanks to all of our wonderful lab team from our lab and from our sister lab, Ted Gibson's lab. This has been a tremendous effort that can only happen as a communal effort. Of course, our wonderful Conlang creators for coming and speaking to us, but also for helping us with the experimental materials, which make the research possible, because I don't speak Conlangs. Saima does a little, somewhat. She's like, no, well, I don't know more than me. And the Duolingo team, who also helped create testing materials and also are sponsoring the prizes for the trivia games, and our other wonderful speakers. So let's just give them all a round of applause. Okay, so some basics. How can we learn about how our brains are organized? We have this mass of cells, a clump of cells inside our skulls. How do we study those things? There's two main approaches that we have for studying human brains. There's a lot more for studying animal brains, but with humans, there's these two main things. One is a method that has been used for centuries, and it's basically to look at the cognition or behavior of people who have sustained some brain damage. So you're basically trying to see whether damage to particular parts of the brain leads to particular kinds of problems. Okay, and this approach is what let us initially figure out that language lives in the left side of the brain. So in most of you here, we don't know if all of you, some of you may be atypically lateralized, but in most of you, your language is in the left half of your brain. And we learned this because damaging your left hemisphere but not your right leads to language problems. The other approach is relatively more recent, and that is functional brain imaging. Its most widely used form, and the form that we used for research this weekend, functional MRI, only became available in the 90s and was developed here in Boston at Mass General Hospital. And using this approach, we can examine activity in healthy living brains. And this is very, very cool. A lot of cool things kind of came together to make this approach work. Using it, we can see which brain areas respond to which tasks, much like we were doing this weekend by seeing which parts of your brain are active when you're processing conlangs. All right. So how can we... So we can ask, right, what brain areas respond when we understand language? So how can we find areas in the brain that care about language? So we can have you read or listen to sentences, much like a lot of you were already doing or will do tomorrow or on Sunday. And we can look for parts of your brain that respond more when you process language, like real sentences that have structure and meaning, compared to some stimuli that look similar or sound similar, but you can't quite get anything out of them, right? They kind of sound like nonsense strings. And we call these tasks language localizer tasks because they help us localize or find the language system in your brains, and then we can ask questions about how that system works. Here are language systems of 6 individual participants. This is showing you a lateral side view of the left side. So if you took away my skull right now, well, you wouldn't see the activity, but you would see that view. And you can see that, and like I said, in most individuals, the system lives in the left hemisphere, and you can see that the language system basically consists of a few different areas. So these are areas that are more active for language versus these control stimuli. And there's some stuff in the frontal lobe, in the front of the head, and on the lateral kind of side surface here. Okay, so what are some of the features that the system has? And this is kind of research over the last few decades, some things we've learned. So one is that the system supports both understanding and production. So when we listen to language or read language or watch somebody sign, if we're understanding somebody who is speaking a sign language, and similarly, when we produce language either through speaking, writing, or signing. So in that sense, there is kind of modality independence in both understanding and production. And these features together suggest that what the system is probably doing in some way is storing our language knowledge, right? So some mappings between forms like words, constructions, and meanings, what these things refer to in the world. And of course, we use these knowledge representations to both take some thought and make it into a string of words so I can tell you what I'm thinking. And I can also hear you say some string of words and I can kind of decode meaning from that, right? Okay. Another property that I already alluded to is that the system seems to be critically important for language, so that if you have damage to parts of the system, you will have problems in understanding language, in producing language, or both. And that can happen as a result of a stroke. Some of you may have relatives, like grandmas and grandpas, who have aphasia as a result of damage to some parts of the system. And interestingly, this only happens if you sustain damage in adulthood. So early damage, if you have a stroke or head trauma as a kid, you will often grow up and have very little consequences. And that is because our brains, when young, are quite flexible, much less so later on, sadly. Okay, and then another relatively recent finding from our group is that it appears that the neural infrastructure for language is quite similar across relatively diverse languages. So remember I showed you some pictures of language systems, so this is one of them. This is a brain of a native speaker of English listening or reading English. And in fact, most of what we know about processing language in the brain comes from the study of native English speakers. You know, if you look in the literature, there's a body of work looking at Germans, you know, basically countries where there's money to do expensive research, right? So there's German, there's Dutch, there's an MPI, Max Planck Institute in the Netherlands, there's some work on French, Spanish, Mandarin, and a few others, but the list very quickly dwindles, and oftentimes there is not a single study that you can find, even clinical studies for even pretty languages that are spoken by quite a few people. And like Damian told us, there's about 7,000 languages spoken and signed across the world. So do they all look the same? Especially given that English is not quite a typical language, right? It's strange in all sorts of ways. It has, for example, more strict word order than most languages do. So does it still look the same in terms of its neural substrates? And Saima did this work, a paper just came out this year, where she showed that the language system looks similar across 45 different languages. Now, this is still a teeny fraction of the 7,000, but it's a much bigger step than what we've known before. And this is going to be an ongoing effort in the coming years. Saima has a long career in front of her. And by making language localizers available to other researchers, we're hoping that this will encourage others to look at a broader range of languages, as well as to, for example, examine properties that are not present in most languages, certainly not in English, right? There's many cool properties that diverse languages have. All right, so now let's go back to thinking about language more broadly. So I told you that in these language areas, schematically shown in red, there's a strong response kind of by definition here to language, more so than to these kind of control stimuli. And I want you to think with me, why is it that language elicits this strong response? What is it about language that these areas like? We've talked about a lot of different components of language today, right? There's many features that language has. I hope some of you have some of these in your head, but I'll walk you through them a little bit, right? So you may be thinking maybe it's the structure of language. Language is a highly structured stimulus. There's all sorts of constraints for how words can go together into phrases and sentences. Maybe it's meaning, right? After all, we use language to communicate meaningful messages to each other. Maybe it's reasoning, because oftentimes when we hear linguistic information, that leads us to build complex causal chains about events in the world, right? There's a lot of kind of thought that may follow. Maybe it's specifically social reasoning. After all of the time when we hear somebody say something, we're trying to understand why are they saying this? What do they want me to know or do in response to their statement? But also, linguistic messages are communicative signals. So maybe it's just their very communicative nature that leads to the strong response. So over the last decade or so, our group has tested these various ideas, and it turns out that none of them are actually right. And I'll tell you why. Okay, so how do you test these ideas? Well, you can look at the response in these language responsive areas to stimuli that are not language, but share these various features, right? So you can look at music and say, music is a very structured stimulus. Does it elicit any response in these language areas? And it turns out it doesn't. It loads on a totally different system in your brain. You can look at meaningful stimuli like pictures or videos of events or objects in the world and see how the language system responds to those. It turns out the response is low to those as well. You can get people to do complicated things, right? Ask them to solve some logical puzzles or do math in the scanner or predict chess moves or whatever, right? Some kind of complex reasoning task, or specifically reason about others' minds. Rebecca Sachs in our department has been studying a system that specializes for understanding what other people think. And it turns out that neither of these things activate the language system. And you can also examine a wide range of communicative signals like facial expressions or body language or even gestures. And it turns out that in the absence of the linguistic signal, all of these stimuli elicit a very low response in the language areas. So in other words, these language responsive areas appear to be highly, highly selective for language. They respond to something specifically linguistic about the structure or about linguistic meaning. In another work, we and others have found that, in fact, both linguistic structure and linguistic meaning matter. But another cool line of work I'll mention very briefly is that in line with the selectivity that we see in our brain imaging work, evidence from patients with brain damage to the language system tells the same story. And that's very cool when very different methods converge. So remember I mentioned that if you damage parts of the language system in adulthood, you typically will have language deficits, or what is referred to as aphasia. In some cases, damage is so extensive it can basically wipe out the whole language system, and you end up with basically a lack of any ability to understand or produce language. This condition is known as global aphasia, totally devastating, very, very difficult thing to live with. But you can ask, okay, these patients have severe language deficits. What can they still do? Can they still solve math problems? Can they play chess like they used to? Can they write music if they wrote music prior to their damage? And it turns out, strikingly, that they can do all of these things. The only thing that these people can do is convert the rich thoughts, same richness as they were before, into sequences of words to convey those thoughts to others. And they can't extract meaning from others' linguistic utterances, but everything else is the same. Okay, so now we'll go back to the statement I made that language areas are selective for language. They're selective for language. What the hell is language anyway? What is a good definition of language, right? I told you that things like, and people sometimes use this word very loosely, but I told you that things like math, which people sometimes talk about like the language of math or music or body language, these things apparently don't activate the same parts of the brain as understanding natural language. But if we think of this kind of, maybe there is some kind of a continuum from not being language to being language, there are some things that fall more kind of in between these things. And one of those things is computer languages, programming languages, right? So Anya Ivanova in our group, right there, did beautiful work looking at how brains of people who understand computer code respond to understanding code. Now, like natural languages, computer code can convey quite a range of languages, but it's a pretty restricted kinds of meanings that you can convey with computer code. And it turns out that the language system doesn't respond much to computer languages. And instead, these languages load on a system that we have in our brains that we use for processing kind of general complex problems. So mathematics also loads on the system. All sorts of other novel problem solving does as well. Okay, so now what we're here today for, what about constructed languages? Where do they fall here? The reason to think that they might recruit the language system is that, well, like natural languages, there are communication systems that allow you to express any meaning you want, pretty much. There's some constraints every now and then, right? But mostly, like, you should be able to express any meaning about the world or your thoughts about the world to another individual who knows the language. But reasons to think that they may not load on natural language processing mechanisms is that they differ in key ways. Like Damian already mentioned, when exactly linguistic capacity emerged in the human lineage remains debated, but regardless of the precise timestamp, it's been a while. Languages have been around for minimally 500,000 years, but probably over 1 million by a lot of recent kind of estimates. And during this time, languages have been changing. They've been co-evolving with our bodies, our brains, our societies. Again, as Damian mentioned, our cultures have changed enormously during this period. And of course, most conlanguages, constructed languages, have much shorter time spans. And they're also not really typically, well, natural languages are very strongly shaped by some combination of pressures for efficient information transmission, right, like the way we normally use languages in kind of conversational interactive settings, as well as by pressures of learning ease, right? And, you know, modulo the Klingon poor kid who, well, poor, I don't know, it's interesting. But aside from that, there's not many cases of kids growing up learning Conlang. So there's just that pressure is not there for a kid to be able to acquire this language. Instead, like we learned, the pressures on Conlangs are really very different kind of pressures. So, drum roll. Are Conlangs similar enough to natural languages to recruit the same brain system, or do they load on general problem-solving mechanisms much like math and computer languages? And Simon will tell you the answer, which he already has. The answer that
All right. So what I'm going to do is something risky, which is a follow up these amazing line of speakers, but also give you very, very preliminary results. Obviously, the point of this conference was to have you all come here and scan your brains. Now, we haven't been able to analyze all the data, but we were very lucky that we had Conlang speakers for some of the languages living around the area who came earlier, and so we are going to share what we found from their data. Some of you have already experienced this, but most of you might be wondering, okay, what is happening in the scanner? What is this fMRI study at all? So I'm just going to briefly go through some of the tasks that we do there. We do an English reading task where you're reading things like sentences that appear one word at a time on your screen, and then you're reading non-words. And I love to describe them as Wordle guesses that Wordle tells you are not words. And we also have an English auditory task that is very similar to the Conlang auditory task that all our Conlang creators helped us develop. So people will be listening to some Conlang, for instance. So hopefully everyone heard that. And then there's a version where we muffle the sound so you're not getting any linguistic input there. I kind of describe it as listening to the radio where you're trying to turn it up to see what people are saying, but you can't quite get what they're saying. So it sounds something like this. Hopefully you heard that. In addition to that, we also tested against a non-linguistic task, so that produces demand on your working memory. So there's a task where we show you a grid and we tell you keep track of this blue square in the grid. As you can see, it's coming up a few times, and then I'm going to ask you which of these two grids you just saw. And then we tell people whether they were right or wrong. There's an easy version and a hard version where people get very, very frustrated trying to keep track of these two blue grids. But in a first, as many firsts for this weekend, I actually had someone get all of them right. So go you. But the point of this task is to have you be very engaged in this working memory demand. All right, so I'm just going to go through each language, and as we can see here is how strongly the language areas respond to these tasks. And I only have data, again, for a couple of speakers for these languages, so I'm just going to preface that. All right, what happens with reading English sentences? So your language network responds to English sentences, but not to the non-word condition. The response is much lower. However, and this is what the English sentences would look like in one of the participants that came in. On the other hand, this is what the working memory, how the working memory, like the language regions respond to the working memory demand. And as you can see, it does not, right? What I'm plotting here is 0 on the line. Now, the question is, what happens with Esperanto? So how many of you think we're going to see, there's two options here. One would be it patterns up like the English sentences and the English non-words, or it could pattern like the working memory demands where like the language system is not responding. So who wants to raise your hand if you think it patterns as the English sentences and non-words? All right. Anyone going for the working memory pattern? That's a great question. They were pretty fluent, not the most fluent of the lot that we are scanning. All right, so you were all right. It did pattern with English. And this is what it looks like in the brain. And just a reminder, this is not a competition between the Conlang creators. All right, so on to Klingon. So again, we have the data for one subject who, their English system is responding the same way as we saw before. The language system is not responding to this working memory task. And the question is, how is it responding to Klingon? So who thinks it's responding just like the English sentences? I'm surprised to see the creator not raising their hand. All right, so here we go. And this is what it looks like in here. Next one up is Navi. So again, we see in this one speaker that we tested the same pattern for the language system responding to English, and it's not responding that much to the spatial working memory task-ish. All right, raise your hand if you think the Navi, the language system is responding to Navi similar to how it does for English. All right. There we go. You were all right. Yeah, that's why it's tricky to. So David is asking why the working memory is up instead of down. That's why we should never present data just from one subject. On average, it tends to be lower. But you're all here, and I know you had questions, so here I am providing some answers. Go ahead.
I just have a question because from my experience as an Esperanto speaker, especially an autistic Esperanto speaker, I know a lot of Conlang people are neurodivergent in some way, whether it's like ADHD or like autism or whatever. And I noticed, especially since you do working memory, which a lot of people with ADHD and like other neurodivergencies struggle with, I kind of wonder, how will they be different from like neurotypical Conlang speakers? Because like, I just wonder that because like, obviously like, I feel like, autistic people and like, respond to language a little bit differently, like in some ways. That's from what I've heard.
From my understanding of the research, the way the language system for autistic people responds is similar to non-autistic people. So we don't expect differences in the language system. We might expect differences in other systems in the brain.
Like in the working memory, because I know like that's definitely like executive function, like working memory is often like hard for people with ADHD.
Yeah, absolutely. So those would tap, as Ev mentioned, into a different system, and there we might expect differences. In fact, we know that the way the working memory system responds, or like this system that responds to the working memory task, it correlates the extent to which it's active is how well you do in the task, right? So there's differences there between people, definitely, but not in the language system.
Okay, good.
Yeah. All right, on to High Valyrian. So again, we have data actually from two speakers. So here's the pattern for English sentences. Here's the pattern for working memory demands. Okay, raise your hand if you believe it is patterning up with English. David has faith in his Conlang. Yay. I didn't see what Paul, you raised your hand for Navi. All right, great. And there we go. It does as well. So yay, one more. So I'm going to go ahead and place these Conlangs next to these other natural languages. All right. And that is what I have for you today. I wanted to say a big thank you for all the EvLab members who are helping scan during this marathon scanning session, and very in particular Maya here, who has done everything from pretending to be a participant to show you how everything goes to organizing everyone. So thank you, everyone. And next we're going to have Thomas do the last round of trivia. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, as I've said, the language system responds to both written and auditory language. And people who've done the task in the scanner know we're doing both the reading the English sentences as well as doing the auditory task where you're listening to passages in English. And the pattern is the same. I think we just have a strong bias to present the written version just because in our lab, that's like the main task that everyone tends to do, and we have data from 800 people to compare it to. But it's the same pattern in this case for written and auditory. Yeah.
So do you know, in particular, do you know what the state of the evidence is about whether and to what extent the capacity for those capacity for written language is sort of parasitic on the capacity for written languages? Like I said, I've heard some linguists speak as if basically speak as if it's assumed they are. I've seen some, there are some things that seem to be consistent with that assumption, like people confusing words that sound like people mixing up words that are pronounced the same when writing quickly, even if they know better when examining carefully.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. Spoken and written language are two completely different things, right? Like you get exposed to spoken language and then you pick up the language as a child. Now, even if you get exposed to like a lot of writing as a child, unless someone's instructing you to learn how to read and how to map those sounds to the letters, you're not going to pick up reading. So it needs a lot of instruction. So there are definitely differences between the two. Go ahead.
But once you learn, it does load on the same system. So I don't know if you want to call it parasitic or not.
I mean, does it ultimately sort of go through spoken language? Because I've heard people speak as if it does.
I don't know what you mean by that. At
I
what
mean,
level
like,
are you asking go through?
I mean, does anyone do people actually process written language directly without access to a phonological level, or are people who are reading generally have a phonological representation on some level of the sort they would have when listening?
There's a lot of differences in how people read. It turns out that proficient readers don't have to go through the phonological representation, but many people do. And even for proficient readers, there is some variability. But like, for example, your auditory cortex is not active when you're reading, even though your language system will work just the same as when it's interpreting auditory language. And there's some specialized reading bits.
Okay,
There are some,
so one last, I promise this is the last one, but have you given any thought to studying less naturalistic constructed languages, like, say, Tokipona or Lojban, and to what extent those might resemble or not resemble?
Yeah, I'd love to test as many languages as possible, but we are limited by time and speakers, so yeah, hopefully one day. Yeah. All right. Are we good on time?
let's take maybe one more question.
Okay,
And
one-
then we'll be out in the discussion area. and people
Oh,
can-
we have the game section, so.
Right, no, I know.
Okay,
After
okay.
the games will like all be there.
Perfect. Yeah, you can always find us to talk about this. I don't know who went first. This is. Go ahead, just because you're.
So I have a question for Evelina. Have you looked at the people's linguistic processing that have aphantasia, who do not have any visual memories whatsoever?
It's not that they don't have visual memories, they don't have visual imagery, right? So when they think about stuff, unlike most people apparently, they don't visualize things in their mind's eye. We haven't, people have studied that population, but not with respect to language as far as I know. Anya, you seem to think that.
I think inner voice might be a closer match, which we still haven't studied, but it's, I don't know if either of you wants to.
But when, if they don't have visual imagery, we also don't have the visual memories. Like the childhood memories do not exist in pictures. Your mother's face does not exist in pictures. That's why I was asking, because most of the memories are actually further away.
Why do you think language would be different than those individuals?
Because I was more interested in the difference in fMRI imaging of the memories of the people who do have visual ability versus the people who don't.
Yeah, I mean, there's work on aphantasia. If you drop me a line, I can send you some recent papers on that population, but.
Yeah, and we'd always be happy to take more questions out in the reception. We don't have time for one more. I'm so sorry.
Would the person who got all of the puzzle right, would they be embarrassed to tell us who they are?
Go ahead. All right, on to the last trivia question.
Okay, so I realize that I am the last thing standing between you and the bar outside and asking all the questions to the researchers and everything, but we do want to give our prizes to our top performing trivia participants. So we're just going to go through each of the languages, and we're going to have the Conlang creator, if that person is alive, ask a question. Okay, so could we please start with the Navi speakers, and could you please come forward, and we will have a question from Peter. Paul, I'm so sorry, from Paul.
Can it be multiple choice? Does it matter?
It's up to you to decide, and also the we don't have buzzers, so we're going to have to just sort of do an honor system. You'll raise your hand as soon as you have the answer, and then we'll call on you, and hopefully we'll be fair with umpiring.
So the Navi trivia question is, Which of the following 4 Navi words did Paul have to come up with on the spot one day when he was on set? Ready? Okay. 1, kame. 2, laureu. 3, im. 4, skaun.
Is it M?
You got it.
Good. Okay, so if you are the first place, you can take your pick of either the Duolingo plushie or the pin, and second place can take the remaining item.
Could I add one thing? That word, by the way, means ass.
I think I'm gonna have to go with the pin. All right.
That's in body part or not?
So next up, we'll have a question from David, and so we didn't have enough speakers to run a trivia for all the Dothraki and Valyrian speakers, but if you are a speaker of Dothraki or Valyrian, please step forward, and you'll be automatically eligible for one of these prizes because there weren't enough speakers to run a trivia. So we have Ruben. Do we have Jill or Vanessa? Okay, well, you still have to answer the question, but even if you lose, you can still, get first.
Okay. Oh, it's not written up here? Do I just have to remember what I said?
Yeah.
All right, okay. All right, first, Dothraki or Valyrian? Which one do you want? All right. How many words and names combined of Dothraki did George R.R. Martin create?
Like 30 something?
How close should we?
14.
How close? How close? Hang on. How close does he need to get? Within 10, within 5, within 20?
Within 100.
Within 100. I'm going to give it to you. It was 56. 56 words and names.
What was the High Valyrian question?
For High Valyrian, 4.
What was that the same thing?
Oh, yeah, same question. How many? No, that was just how many words, because there were a bunch of names. How many High Valyrian words did George R. R. Martin create? And that was 4. Yeah.
Whoa.
Okay, so next up we'll have the Klingon speakers, so the 2 top Klingon finalists. You know who you are. You got to get your battle cries in. And we'll have a question from Mark.
All right, now the difficulty here, especially with these 2, is they know more Klingon trivia than I do.
I've been thinking, what is the question he will ask me?
Well, I ask him too. So I think the way this game is going to work is more like Jeopardy. So and what I mean by that is it doesn't matter what you know; it's how you work the buzzer.
Okay.
Because you'll probably both get it. Nevertheless, there's 2 published, meaning in paper, dictionaries of Klingon. There's the Klingon dictionary, but also in Klingon for the Galactic Traveler, there's like a supplementary dictionary. On the Klingon English side of that dictionary, which is called Klingon, what is it called? Klingon Federation Standard or something. We stopped using the word English at some point. Okay. The very first word is bachcha. What's interesting about that?
It is, the entry is an error, and the word means error.
Right.
It's interesting to observe, like, who chooses what for the first versus second place privilege. I think so. This one has some House of the Dragon, theme, so that might affect the choices. Okay, so for the final category, it'll be Esperanto, and unfortunately, we could not get Zamenhof to come join us, but Simon will be taking the place of the Conlang creator to ask the final question.
All right, so this question was asked by Ramsey Cartwell from Duolingo.
One of my students.
Oh boy.
Oh, yeah.
All right. And the question is, Who are Adam and Sophia? Do we know who do? I think there's enough prizes for both of them.
Say it at the same time.
Yeah.
The children of Zamenhof.
All right. Yeah, you got it. You can. And without much ado, thank you everyone for attending. I'm not going to stand in the way of your drinks and mingling with each other. Go ahead.